Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. It was the summer of '79, and I was driving my family back from a camping trip in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. My wife, Janet, and our two little girls, Amy, 6, and Sarah, 4, were fast asleep in our old Chevy Impala. The radio was barely working, just static mostly, so I had turned it off. It was around 2 a.m., and I was getting tired, but we were only about an hour from home, so I figured I'd push through. Highway 2 was practically empty at that hour. I hadn't seen another car for at least 30 minutes. The moon was bright that night, and the tall pines on either side of the road cast long shadows across the pavement. I was doing about 80 milliseconds. Yeah, I know, too fast. But back then, that's just how we drove, especially on empty roads. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just two red reflections in my headlights, maybe 3/4 of a mile ahead. Nothing unusual about that. We often saw deer and other wildlife on that stretch, but something felt different. The reflections were too high off the ground for a deer, way too high. I remember thinking maybe it was someone in a reflective jacket, but who would be standing in the middle of Highway 2 at 2 a.m.? As I got closer, I started to slow down a bit. The reflections weren't moving. Usually, animals would dart away from approaching headlights, but whatever this was, it was just standing there. When I was about 200 yards away, I finally realized what I was seeing, and my blood ran cold. Those weren't reflections. They were eyes, red eyes, and they belonged to something that was standing upright in the middle of my lane. I slammed on the brakes. The tires squealed. I can still hear that sound in my nightmares. Blue smoke filled my rear-view mirror as the car fishtailed slightly. Janet stirred but didn't wake up. The girls stayed asleep too, thank God. I managed to bring the car to a stop about 30 feet from it. My headlights were illuminating something that my brain couldn't, and still can't, fully process. It was tall. So impossibly tall. I'm 6'2", and this thing would have towered over me by at least 4 or 5 feet. It had to be around 11 feet tall. But it wasn't just the height that was disturbing. It was how thin it was. Its proportions were all wrong. The arms, Jesus, the arms hung down past its knees. They weren't bulky like a gorilla's. They were long and thin, like branches of a dead tree. The thing that really gets me, even now, was its stillness. It just stood there, perfectly motionless, staring at me with those red eyes. Not aggressive, not scared, just watching. Its body was dark, darker than the night around it. I couldn't make out any clear features except for those eyes and its basic shape. The headlights seemed to get swallowed up by whatever covered its body, fur, skin, I don't know. For what felt like an eternity, probably about a minute and a half in reality, we just stayed like that. Me, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white, and this being standing in the road studying me. I couldn't move. I couldn't even blink. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Then it moved. The movement itself was almost as terrifying as its appearance. It was so smooth, so deliberate. It turned its head to the left, toward the forest, but not like a person would. The motion was too fluid, almost like its neck had extra joints. Then, with 2 steps, just 2 impossibly long strides, it reached the edge of the road. Before disappearing into the trees, it turned its head back toward me one last time. That head turn. It wasn't natural. It was like watching something that had learned to mimic human movement, but hadn't quite gotten it right. And then it was gone. Just like that. No sound, no rustling of branches, nothing. It simply melted into the darkness between the trees. I sat there for maybe 5 minutes, my hands still gripping the wheel, trying to process what I'd just seen. Janet finally woke up and asked why we had stopped. I couldn't tell her. I just mumbled something about thinking I'd seen a deer and started driving again, probably 20 mph under the speed limit the rest of the way home. The thing is, I grew up in Michigan. I've been in those woods my whole life. I know what bears look like, even standing up. I know about cougars, wolves, and every other animal in those forests. What I saw that night wasn't any of those. It wasn't a person in a costume either. The movements were too fluid, too inhuman, and who would be out there in the middle of nowhere pulling a prank at 2 a.m.? I drove that stretch of Highway 2 hundreds of times after that night, always half expecting to see it again. I never did. Sometimes I wish I would, just to prove to myself that it really happened. The rational part of my brain wants to dismiss it as a hallucination brought on by fatigue, but I know what I saw. Those eyes, that impossible height, those unnatural movements, they're burned into my memory. I've read about other encounters since then, especially in that area. Some details match up with what I saw, others don't. I've never reported it officially. What would I say? Who would believe me? But I know it was real. Sometimes, on quiet nights when I can't sleep, I find myself thinking about those red eyes and wondering, was I just the first person to see it in that area? Or was I just one of the few who lived to tell about it? I'm 73 now, and I still won't drive that road at night. Call me a coward if you want, but unless you've seen something like that, something that shouldn't exist but undeniably does, you can't understand. I don't know what it was. I don't want to know. But I do know one thing. Whatever I saw that night on Highway 2, it wasn't from our world. And the worst part, I'm convinced it knew exactly what it was doing. It wanted me to see it. Why? That's the question that keeps me up at night, even after all these years. Story 2. I've never told this story outside my immediate family, but what happened to me in Muskegon County back in '79 still haunts me. I was 27 then, working as a land surveyor, and had recently bought a small cabin on about 40 acres of wooded land. It was my pride and joy, nothing fancy, just a simple 2-bedroom place where I could escape the city on weekends. That summer, I started noticing strange things around my property. At first, it was just little stuff that I brushed off. Some of my firewood would be scattered in the mornings, even though I always stacked it carefully. I'd find weird scratches on trees that were too high up to be from any normal wildlife. But what really started getting to me was this feeling of being watched whenever I'd work outside. You know that prickly sensation on the back of your neck? I had it constantly. I remember the exact date everything went to hell, October 12th, 1979. It was unseasonably warm for Michigan that day, and I'd driven up Thursday night to do some maintenance work around the property before winter set in. I spent most of Friday clearing brush and checking my property lines. Around 4 p.m., I hiked out to the back portion of my land where it bordered state forest. That's when I found something that made my blood run cold. There was this cluster of deer bones, all stacked up in these neat little pillars, about 2 or 3 feet high, not scattered like you'd expect from predators. These were deliberately placed. Some were bleached white from the sun, others still had bits of tissue on them. The way they were arranged, it wasn't natural. No animal does that. And the smell, God, the smell. This sickly, sweet, rotting odor mixed with something else, something musky and wild that made my nose burn. About 50 yards from the bone pillars, I found what looked like a den dug into a hillside. It was huge, probably 6 feet high at the entrance, and there were these massive scratches around the opening. My first thought was bears, but something felt off. Bear dens aren't usually that tall, and these claw marks, they didn't look right. I should have left right then, should have gotten in my truck and never looked back. but I was stupid and curious. I decided to wait until dusk and set up near the den with my binoculars. I figured if there was some kind of predator making trouble, I needed to know what I was dealing with. Around 7:30, the sun was pretty much gone. I was sitting on this fallen log about 100 yards from the den, trying to stay downwind. That's when I heard it, this deep, rumbling sound, like a growl, but wrong somehow. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, made my chest vibrate. I raised my binoculars, scanning the tree line. The moon was bright enough that I could still see pretty well. That's when I spotted it. Through the brush, maybe 75 yards away, there was this head. Just a head, poking above some low branches, about 5 to 6 feet off the ground. In the moonlight, I could make out a massive, broad face, almost human-like, but not quite. The eyes caught the moonlight and reflected it back like a cat's. My hands were shaking so bad I dropped the binoculars. They hit the log with a crack that seemed deafening in the quiet forest. The head snapped toward the sound, and I saw the branches move as whatever it was started moving my way. I ran. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I ran like hell. But the thing is, when you're panicked, running through a dark forest is nearly impossible. I kept tripping over roots, smacking into branches, and the whole time I could hear it behind me, not crashing through the brush like I was, but moving swift and purposeful. The footfalls were heavy but spaced out, like it was taking these massive strides. The worst part was the smell, that same musky odor from the bone piles, getting stronger as it got closer. My lungs were burning, partly from running, partly from that stench. I could hear it breathing, these deep, powerful breaths that didn't sound winded at all. I had maybe a quarter-mile to go to reach my cabin. My flashlight beam was bouncing wildly as I ran, throwing crazy shadows everywhere. At one point, I glanced back. Biggest mistake of my life. In the strobe-like effect of my bobbing flashlight, I caught glimpses of something massive running upright through the trees. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark hair. The arms were impossibly long, swinging with each stride, but it was the face that still shows up in my nightmares. That same broad, almost human face I'd seen before, but now twisted into something primitive and hungry. I don't remember reaching the cabin. 1 minute I was running, the next I was inside, slamming the door and grabbing my shotgun. I spent the next few hours huddled in a corner, gun trained on the door. Something circled the cabin for hours. I could hear the heavy footsteps on my porch, hear deep breathing outside my windows. Every now and then there would be this sound, like wood creaking under enormous pressure, as it tested the strength of my walls. Around 3 a.m., everything went quiet. Too quiet. No crickets, no nightbirds, nothing. I stayed in that corner until sunrise, too terrified to move. When I finally worked up the courage to look outside, I found massive footprints all around my cabin, 18 inches long if they were an inch. The prints were deep, like whatever made them weighed several hundred pounds. My porch railing was splintered in places, like something had gripped it too hard. I sold the cabin 3 months later. Couldn't even bring myself to go back except in daylight with friends to pack up my stuff. The new owners apparently haven't had any problems, but I've heard rumors about similar encounters deeper in the state forest. I've spent 45 years trying to rationalize what happened that night. Could have been a bear, right? But bears don't stack bones. Bears don't run on 2 legs. And bears don't have faces that look almost human. Sometimes when I'm lying awake at night, I can still smell that musky odor, still hear those heavy footfalls. I don't go camping anymore, don't even like being in the woods during daylight, because now I know that sometimes, when you get that feeling of being watched in the forest, you are. And whatever's watching might be a lot more than just a curious animal. I don't expect anyone to believe this story. Hell, sometimes I'm not sure I believe it myself. But I know what I saw that night in Muskegon County, and I know there are things in this world that we're better off not understanding. Things that shouldn't exist but do. Things that watch and wait in the dark places of the world. The locals still talk about strange happenings in those woods. Just last year, I heard about some hikers finding more bone pillars out there. I didn't stick around to hear the rest of that story. Some memories are better left buried. Story 3. I was 27 at the time, had been bow hunting since I was a teenager. Me and 2 buddies, Mike and Steve, decided to head out to the state forest for the October bow season. We'd been planning this trip for months, checking our gear, scouting locations. It was supposed to be just another hunting trip. The first day was normal enough. We set up our base camp, nothing fancy, just 3 tents and a common area for cooking and hanging out. The weather was perfect for hunting, crisp autumn air, leaves just starting to turn. We spent that day tracking deer movements and setting up our individual hunting spots. I found a good location about half a mile from camp, up on a slight ridge that gave me a decent view of a natural deer trail. But it was that second day when everything went sideways. I remember every detail like it happened yesterday, even though it's been 45 years. I got to my spot early, around 2 p.m. The sun was still high, filtering through the canopy. I was in my hunting clothes, brown camo jacket, orange vest, safety first, sturdy boots. Had my compound bow, arrows with broadheads, everything I'd used 100 times before. The first couple hours were quiet. Too quiet, actually. Looking back, I should have noticed how strange it was. No squirrels, no birds, nothing. It was like everything just cleared out. Around 4:30, that's when things started getting weird. I was sitting on my portable stool, staying still as we hunters do, when I heard the first crack. Now, I'd heard plenty of branches break in the woods before, deer, black bears, you name it. But this was different. It was loud, like someone had snapped a baseball bat in half. It came from maybe 100 yards to my left, deep in a thickly wooded area. My first thought was that maybe a dead tree had fallen. But then I heard another crack, closer this time, and another. Whatever was making these sounds was moving, and it was moving fast. The breaks weren't random. They had a pattern to them like footsteps. But the stride length, man, it had to be huge to make that kind of distance between breaks. That's when the vocalization started. I've spent my whole life in these woods, heard every animal you can think of, bears, coyotes, owls, you name it. But this sound froze the blood in my veins. It started as this low, guttural sound, almost like someone trying to clear their throat. Then it changed into this bizarre, slurred howling. The closest thing I can compare it to is maybe a drunk person trying to yell, but amplified about 10 times. It had this human quality to it that made my skin crawl. I remember gripping my bow so tight my knuckles were white. The sound kept going for what felt like forever, but was probably about 3 minutes. It would rise and fall, sometimes sounding angry, sometimes almost mournful. And it was loud, loud enough that I'm sure it carried for at least a mile. Then, just like that, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I sat there, barely breathing, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Every instinct was screaming at me to get the hell out of there, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, caught between fear and this overwhelming need to know what had made those sounds. After what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes, I slowly stood up. My legs were shaking so bad I nearly fell over. I knocked an arrow, fat lot of good that would have done me looking back, and started moving toward where the sounds had come from. The undergrowth was thick as hell in that direction, lots of thorny bushes and fallen trees. I only made it about 30 yards before I hit a wall of vegetation I couldn't get through without making a ton of noise. The ground was soft there, still damp from rain earlier in the week. That's when I saw them, the tracks. They weren't clear prints, more like deep depressions in the soil, but they were huge. way bigger than any human foot I'd ever seen. The stride length between them was insane, easily 6 feet apart. I didn't have a camera with me. This was 1979, remember? And I've kicked myself 1,000 times for that. I stood there staring at those impressions in the ground, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. Then I heard another crack, this time from behind me, back toward my hunting spot. I spun around so fast I nearly lost my balance. Whatever it was circling around. That's when the smell hit me. If you've ever been around a dead animal that's been sitting in the sun for a few days, it was kind of like that, but mixed with this musty, wet dog smell. It was so strong it made my eyes water. I'd love to tell you I stood my ground or tried to track whatever it was, but that would be a lie. I got out of there as fast as I could while trying to stay quiet. I kept thinking about my buddies back at camp, wondering if they could hear any of this. The walk back felt like it took forever. Every shadow looked like a massive figure. Every rustle in the leaves sounded like footsteps. When I finally got back to camp, Mike and Steve were already there. They'd been hunting about a mile away in the opposite direction and hadn't heard a thing. I tried to tell them what happened, but I could tell they didn't believe me. Steve joked about me drinking too early in the day, and Mike suggested maybe I'd heard a bear. We stayed one more night because they insisted, but I didn't sleep a wink. I kept hearing things moving around our camp, but whenever I shined my flashlight out there was nothing. The next morning, I made up some excuse about not feeling well, and we packed up early. It wasn't until years later that I started reading about other people's encounters with Bigfoot. The descriptions of the sounds, the wood knocks, the footprints, it all matched what I experienced that day. I've never gone back to that specific spot in Kent County, and I gave up bow hunting altogether the next year. Some people might say I'm a coward for that, but they weren't there. I still go fishing, still camp occasionally, but always in open areas now, never deep in the woods. And I never go alone. Whatever I encountered that day changed something in me. It showed me that there are things in our forests that we can't explain, things that defy our understanding of what's possible. I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything. I'm just telling you what happened to me on that October afternoon in 1979. Sometimes late at night when everything's quiet, I can still hear those sounds, those horrible, almost human sounds, echoing in my memory. And I wonder if somewhere out there, in the forests of Michigan, that thing is still walking around, still making those sounds, still leaving those massive footprints for someone else to find. Story 4. Let me share my experience from that summer day in Livingston County, something that still gives me chills thinking about it 48 years later. I was just an 8-year-old kid back then, completely obsessed with exploring nature and collecting interesting rocks and leaves. My best friend Tommy, who was 9, and I would spend countless hours wandering around the train tracks near our homes. Our parents always warned us to be careful, but like most kids in the 70s, we had a lot of freedom to roam around. That particular day started like any other. It was late August, and the air was thick with humidity. Tommy and I had decided to follow the tracks to the old railroad bridge that crossed over the Hon River. We'd been there dozens of times before. It was one of our favorite spots to throw rocks into the water and watch the ripples. We were maybe about 50 feet from the bridge when this overwhelming stench hit us. I remember it so vividly because I'd never smelled anything quite like it before or since. It was this horrible combination of rotting meat and something else, like spoiled cabbage or garbage left in the sun too long. My first thought was that maybe a deer had been hit by a train and died somewhere nearby. That wasn't uncommon in our area, and Tommy and I, being curious kids, decided to investigate. As we got closer to the bridge, the smell got stronger, making my eyes water. We were walking more slowly now, partly because we were trying to spot the source of the smell, and partly because the wooden railroad ties were spaced just far enough apart that we had to be careful with our steps. The bridge itself was about 20 feet above the river, made of old weathered wood and rusty metal. What happened next is something that completely changed how I view the world. We were just at the start of the bridge, looking down at the riverbank, when I saw it. At first, my brain couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. About 20 feet below us, on the eastern bank of the river, there was this thing. The first thing that caught my eye were these massive, hulking shoulders covered in dark brown fur. They were so huge that they made the creature's head look weirdly small in comparison. The fur wasn't matted or patchy like you might see on a bear. It was thick and uniform, almost like a well-groomed dog's coat, but darker and coarser looking. The creature was hunched over, almost squatting by the water's edge. Its posture was eerily human-like, but everything about its proportions was wrong. Those shoulders had to be at least twice as wide as my dad's, and he was a pretty big guy. The way it was positioned, it seemed to be staring intently at something in the water, though I couldn't see what. I remember feeling Tommy grab my arm so tight it hurt. Neither of us said a word. We were literally frozen in place. The only sounds were the gentle flow of the river below and the distant chirping of birds. The creature was absolutely still, like a statue, which somehow made it even more terrifying. Then something shifted. Maybe a small rock tumbled down the bank, or one of us made a tiny sound we weren't even aware of, but the creature's head turned slightly. It wasn't enough to see its face, thank God, but that small movement snapped us out of our paralysis. I don't even remember making a conscious decision to run. 1 second we were standing there, and the next we were sprinting back the way we came. I've never run so fast in my life. The railroad ties that we usually had to carefully navigate became a blur under our feet. I remember the thunder of our footsteps on the wooden tracks, the sound of our panicked breathing, and this overwhelming fear that if I looked back, it would be right behind us. My legs were burning, and I could hear Tommy crying as we ran, but we didn't stop until we reached the point where the tracks crossed Parker Road. When we finally stopped, both of us were sobbing and could barely breathe. We looked back, but there was nothing following us. The woods looked exactly like they always had, peaceful and ordinary in the afternoon sun. But we knew what we'd seen. We ran straight to my house, which was closer. My mom was in the kitchen making lunch, and I remember her face changing from annoyed, because we were tracking dirt into the house, to concerned when she saw the state we were in. When we tried to explain what happened, the words came tumbling out in a jumbled mess. She obviously didn't believe us. She thought we'd just scared ourselves by letting our imaginations run wild. That was the last time Tommy and I ever went to the bridge. We didn't even talk about it much between ourselves after that day. What would be the point? Nobody believed us anyway. Tommy's family moved away the following year, and eventually I convinced myself that maybe we had somehow misinterpreted what we saw. But deep down, I know what I witnessed that day was real. I'm 56 now, and I've spent countless hours researching similar sightings in Michigan over the years. There have been other reports from Livingston County, some eerily similar to what Tommy and I saw. I've never gone public with this story before because, honestly, who wants to be known as the crazy person who claims they saw Bigfoot? But I know what I saw that day wasn't a bear, wasn't a person in a costume, and wasn't my imagination. Those massive shoulders and that dark fur are burned into my memory forever. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, or if others have seen it in that same spot. I've never had the courage to go back to that bridge, even as an adult. Some memories are better left in the past, but this one has never really let go of me. Every time I catch a whiff of something rotting, or hear about another strange sighting in Michigan's woods, I'm right back there on those train tracks, staring down at something that shouldn't exist. Story 5. That September, my grandmother asked if we could build her a small cabin in the woods behind her house. She wanted a quiet place to paint and read, away from the chaos of having all her grandkids running around the main house during family gatherings. The property had about 40 acres of dense forest behind it, mostly maple and oak trees. We'd played in those woods all our lives, so it seemed like the perfect project. We started work on September 8th. I remember the date clearly because it was my little sister's birthday, and I had to rush to finish up that day to make it to her party. The weather was starting to turn crisp, but it was still warm enough to work comfortably in just a flannel shirt. We'd cleared the spot for the foundation earlier that week, about 400 yards into the woods, where there was a natural clearing. Everything was totally normal that morning. Tommy and Steve were laying out the foundation markers while I was unloading lumber from my pickup. Around 10:30, I heard what sounded like branches snapping, not just small twigs, but the sharp crack of larger limbs breaking. At first, I figured it was probably a deer. We saw them all the time in those woods. But then the sounds got closer, and they had a rhythm to them that didn't match how deer move. It was more deliberate, like footsteps, heavy footsteps. I stopped what I was doing and looked toward the noise. That's when I saw it, something moving between the trees about 50 yards away. My first impression was that it was brown, kind of a light sandy color, and way too big to be a deer. It was moving upright, but in that split second before it disappeared behind a thick stand of maples, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. I called out to Tommy and Steve, but by the time they looked up, whatever it was had gone. They laughed it off, saying I was trying to scare them. I tried to laugh too, but something felt wrong. The woods had gone completely silent. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Anyone who spends time in the forest knows that's never a good sign. We kept working, but I couldn't shake this feeling of being watched. You know that prickly sensation on the back of your neck? It was like that, but about 10 times stronger. Every few minutes, I'd hear another branch snap in the distance, but never close enough to see what was causing it. By the end of the day, I'd almost convinced myself I was being paranoid. We got a good start on the foundation and made plans to come back the following weekend to begin framing. Tommy and Steve brought their younger brother Danny along that time. He was 15 and always tagging along on our projects. September 17th. I'll never forget that date as long as I live. We arrived early, around 8 a.m. The morning fog was still hanging low in the trees, and there was this weird smell in the air, kind of musky and sharp, like wet dog mixed with something worse. Danny kept complaining about it, but we told him it was probably just a dead animal somewhere in the woods. We'd been working for maybe 2 hours when I noticed something wasn't right with the fence post at the edge of the clearing. There was something dark huddled against it, maybe 30 yards from where we were working. At first glance, I thought someone had dumped an old fur coat there. But then it moved. I nudged Tommy and pointed. We all stopped what we were doing and just stared. What we saw, I still have trouble describing it without sounding crazy. It was sitting there, legs pulled up to its chest, arms wrapped around them, just watching us. The body was covered in light brown hair, but patchy in places, showing darker skin underneath. The face, God, the face, it was too human, but not human enough. The eyes were deep-set and dark, and they were fixed right on us with an intelligence that made my blood run cold. Danny screamed. I don't blame him. I wanted to scream too, but my throat had closed up. The thing's head snapped toward the sound, and in one fluid motion, it stood up. That's when we saw how big it really was. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, with shoulders twice as broad as any man I've ever seen. Its arms hung down past its knees, and its hands, they were massive, with long fingers that looked strong enough to crush a baseball bat. We ran. All 4 of us just turned and sprinted back toward my grandmother's house. I could hear it moving behind us, not chasing exactly, but keeping pace just inside the tree line. The footsteps were heavy enough to vibrate through the ground. None of us looked back until we reached the edge of the woods. When we finally did turn around, it was standing there at the edge of the trees, just standing and watching, like it was studying us. The morning sun was behind it, casting its shadow all the way to our feet. We stood there frozen for what felt like forever, just staring at each other. Then it made this sound, not quite a growl, not quite a groan, but something in between that made every hair on my body stand up. It turned and walked back into the woods, moving with a grace that seemed impossible for something so large. We never went back to finish the cabin. My grandmother was upset at first, but something must have shown on our faces when we tried to explain, because she never brought it up again. We learned later that other people in the area had been hearing strange screams in the woods at night and finding weird footprints in their gardens. But nobody else ever reported seeing what we saw. I've spent decades trying to rationalize what happened that day. I've read every scientific paper I could find about known species in Michigan. I've looked at every alternative explanation, every possibility that it could have been a bear or some other animal. But I know what I saw. Those eyes, they still haunt my dreams sometimes. They were too aware, too intelligent. Whatever was out there that day, it wasn't just watching us. It was thinking, reasoning, maybe even trying to figure us out just like we were trying to figure it out. The weirdest part, when we went back a few days later with my uncle, who had a hunting rifle and insisted on checking things out, all our tools and materials were stacked neatly by the foundation. Not scattered or destroyed, stacked. The only evidence anything had been there were some massive, human-like footprints in the soft dirt, and that same musky smell lingering in the air. I still drive by my grandmother's old property sometimes. She passed away in '89. The woods are still there, though they've been partially cleared for new houses. Every time I pass, I slow down and look into those trees, and every time I get that same prickly feeling on the back of my neck, like something's watching, waiting, remembering. I don't expect anyone to believe this story. Hell, sometimes I have trouble believing it myself. But I know what I saw that day, what we all saw. And I know that somewhere in those Michigan woods there are things that science can't explain. Things that make you question everything you think you know about what's real and what isn't. Danny's the only other one still alive who was there that day. We talked about it recently, for the first time in years. He's got kids of his own now, and he never lets them play in the woods behind their house. When I asked him why, he just looked at me and said, "You know why." And I do. Some things you just don't forget, no matter how many years pass. Some things change the way you see the world forever. Story 6. Back then, I was living in Midland County, Michigan, working as a part-time librarian. Laurie was 16, and we'd often drive around the quieter county roads in our old Chevy Nova after I picked her up from her after-school job at the local diner. It was our little mother-daughter tradition, just cruising around, chatting about her day, making plans for the weekend. October 12th started just like any other Wednesday. The sun was setting earlier those days, and by 6:30 p.m., dusk was already settling in. The weather was unusually warm for October in Michigan, probably in the mid-60s, and there was this heavy dampness in the air from the rain we'd had earlier. We were driving down Patterson Road, a route we'd taken hundreds of times before. The road was lined with thick woods on both sides, and fallen leaves carpeted the asphalt. I remember every detail so vividly. Laurie was telling me about her chemistry test, and I had just turned down the radio because she was getting to the part about whether she passed or not. The headlights were on, cutting through the growing darkness. We weren't going very fast, maybe 35 mph, because this stretch of road was known for deer crossing. That's what I initially thought it was when I first caught movement in my peripheral vision, just another deer. But what happened next? God, even now it makes my heart race. This thing, it just launched itself from the tree line on the right side of the road. But it didn't move like any animal I'd ever seen. It didn't gallop or bound like a deer. It leaped. In one fluid motion, it cleared about 30 feet horizontally, arcing maybe 4 feet into the air. The headlights caught it mid-jump, and that's when I realized we weren't dealing with any normal wildlife. The figure was completely black, not like fur or clothing, but this uniform, matte black from head to toe. It was tall and unnaturally thin, almost skeletal, but moved with this incredible athletic power. It landed in the middle of the road, and without missing a beat, made another identical leap across the remaining width of the road, disappearing into the woods on the left side. Laurie screamed and slammed on the brakes. She was driving that night because she'd just gotten her license and wanted the practice. The car skidded a bit on the wet leaves, and I grabbed the dashboard, my heart feeling like it was going to burst out of my chest. We were maybe 200 feet away when it crossed, but the image is burned into my memory like a brand. The whole thing happened in seconds, but time felt wrong somehow. You know how people talk about time slowing down during accidents? This was different. It was like watching a video where some frames were missing. The creature's movement was so precise, so calculated, it didn't seem natural. We sat there in the middle of the road for what felt like forever, both of us breathing hard, the car engine idling. The headlights illuminated the spot where it had crossed, but there was nothing there. No footprints, no disturbance in the leaves, nothing to prove what we'd just witnessed. "Mom?" Laurie's voice was barely a whisper. "What was that?" I didn't have an answer then, and I still don't have one now. What I can tell you is what it wasn't. It wasn't a deer. The posture was all wrong, completely upright. It wasn't a bear, too thin, too agile. It wasn't a person in a costume. No one could jump like that, and the proportions were wrong. The arms were too long, the torso too narrow. After a few minutes, Laurie put the car in gear, and we drove home in complete silence. The radio stayed off. We kept checking the rearview mirrors, but nothing followed us. When we got home, we sat in the driveway for a long time, neither of us wanting to be the first to get out of the car. That night, neither of us could sleep. We sat at the kitchen table until dawn, drinking cup after cup of coffee, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. We drew pictures, compared notes, made sure our stories matched. They did, down to the smallest detail. The next day, I called the local police station, but I could tell from the deputy's tone that he was just humoring me. Laurie and I drove back to that stretch of road in broad daylight. We walked along the shoulder, looking for any sign of what we'd seen, broken branches, unusual marks, anything. There was nothing. We never drove down Patterson Road after dark again. Laurie took the long way to work, adding 20 minutes to her commute, and I didn't blame her one bit. Something about that encounter fundamentally changed how we viewed the world. You go through life thinking you understand the rules, thinking you know what's possible and what isn't. Then something like this happens, and you realize you don't know anything at all. Over the years, I've read about other sightings in Michigan, some similar to what we saw, others completely different. I've read about Bigfoot, about skinwalkers, about all sorts of creatures that supposedly roam the woods. None of the descriptions quite match what we saw that night. Our creature wasn't huge and hairy like Bigfoot. It was lean, almost emaciated, with that strange matte black surface that didn't reflect light the way fur or clothing would. Laurie's 62 now, with grandkids of her own, but she's never wavered in her account of what happened. Sometimes when we get together, usually late at night after everyone else has gone to bed, we'll talk about it. We still get goosebumps. We still check the windows when we hear unusual noises at night. We still wonder. I'm sharing this now because I'm getting older, and I don't want this story to die with me. I don't expect anyone to believe it. I'm not sure I would believe it if someone else told me this story. But I know what we saw. It was real, It happened. And somewhere out there, in the woods of Midland County, there might still be something that defies explanation, making impossible leaps across dark roads on quiet autumn evenings. I don't have any grand conclusions or theories to offer. No explanation for what it was or why it was there. Sometimes I think that's the scariest part. Not the creature itself, but the fact that something like that could exist in our world without explanation. It makes you wonder what else might be out there, just at the edge of our headlights, just beyond our understanding. Story 7. That particular night in December 77 is burned into my memory like it happened yesterday. The temperature had dropped to about 15 degrees, and we had about 10 inches of fresh powder on the ground from a storm that had blown through earlier that week. Perfect conditions for riding. Dad was inside the cabin, probably listening to the Tigers game on the radio or reading one of his hunting magazines. He always let me ride alone, as long as I stayed within our usual boundaries. I knew those trails like the back of my hand. I had taken out our 76 Ski-Doo. Man, I loved that machine. It wasn't the newest model, but Dad kept it in perfect condition. The sun had set maybe an hour earlier, but with the full moon and snow reflection, visibility was actually pretty decent. I'd been out for about 45 minutes, just enjoying the crisp air and the sound of the engine echoing through the trees. You know that feeling when the cold air hits your face through your helmet visor? That sharp, clean sensation that makes you feel completely alive. That's what I was experiencing. I decided to go off trail a bit, into this area of state land we often used for deer hunting. It was mostly cedar trees, not too dense. The trunks were maybe 10 inches across on average. I was weaving between them, not going too fast, maybe 20 mph tops. The headlight was cutting through the darkness, creating these weird shadows as I moved. Everything was normal, just another night ride. Then something caught my eye off to the right, maybe 40 yards ahead. At first, I thought it was just another shadow from the trees, you know. But as I got closer, my brain started trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There was this massive cedar tree, thicker than the others, and behind it, well, that's when everything changed. I saw this figure. It was partially hidden behind the tree, but not hidden enough. The thing that strikes me most, even now, was how it was positioned. It had its left hand on the tree trunk, and it was looking over its left arm, kind of like how you'd peek around a corner. But what made my blood run cold was the height. The tree was easily 20 feet tall, and this thing's head was more than a third of the way up. I'm not great at math, but I knew right then I was looking at something at least 7 feet tall, probably more. The worst part, the part that still gives me nightmares, was its eyes. They caught the reflection from my snowmobile's headlight, just like deer eyes do at night, but they were higher off the ground than any deer's eyes should be. They had this amber glow to them, and they were fixed right on me. The intelligence in those eyes, it wasn't animal-like at all. It knew exactly what it was doing, trying to hide but watching me at the same time. I could see most of its body on the other side of the tree. The contrast of its dark shape against the snow is something I'll never forget. It was massive, not just tall, but wide. The shoulders must have been twice as broad as mine. The thing was covered in what looked like dark hair, but in the poor light I couldn't tell if it was brown or black. It wasn't like fur you'd see on a bear. It was more like human hair just all over its body. My whole body went cold, and I'm not talking about the December air. You know that feeling when your stomach drops and your throat closes up? It was like that, but 100 times worse. Time seemed to slow down, but my mind was racing. I remember thinking, this isn't real, this can't be real. But it was real, too real. The thing that really gets me, even now, is how still it was. Despite its size, it was barely moving, just standing there, watching me. It wasn't aggressive, wasn't charging or making threats. It was almost like it was as surprised to see me as I was to see it. But there was something calculating in the way it was partially hidden behind that tree, something that suggested intelligence and purpose. I don't know how long we stayed like that. Probably only a few seconds, but it felt like hours. Then my survival instincts kicked in. I didn't think, I just reacted. I yanked the handlebar to the left and opened up the throttle full blast. The engine roared, and snow sprayed everywhere as I made the turn. I didn't look back. I couldn't look back. The sound of my racing engine echoed through the trees as I weaved my way back toward the cabin. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely control the snowmobile. I kept thinking I could hear something running through the woods parallel to my path, but it was probably just my imagination, combined with the echo of the engine bouncing off the trees. The ride back to the cabin probably only took 3 or 4 minutes, but it felt like forever. I practically fell off the snowmobile when I got back. I ran inside, probably white as a sheet, and found my dad sitting in his usual chair. He took one look at me and knew something was wrong. When I told him what I'd seen, he grabbed his rifle and we went back out together on his snowmobile. We searched the area for almost an hour, but found nothing, no tracks. The snow was too powdery and had already started drifting. No broken branches, nothing. Dad tried to convince me it was probably just a bear standing on its hind legs, but I know what I saw. Bears don't have those eyes, don't stand that way, don't try to hide behind trees while watching you. Whatever I saw that night was something else entirely. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those deer-like eyes staring at me from behind that tree. The next morning, Dad and I went back out in the daylight to look around. We found a few broken branches high up in some trees, way too high for a bear to reach. But that was it. No definitive evidence of what I'd encountered. That was my last night ride alone. I still went snowmobiling after that, but only during the day, and never by myself. Dad sold the cabin a few years later when he got transferred to Ohio for work, but I've kept track of that area over the years. Every now and then, I hear stories from around Gladwin County. Hunters seeing strange things in the woods, unusual sounds at night, weird tracks in the snow. I never say anything, just listen and remember. I'm 60 now, and I've spent decades trying to make sense of what I saw that night. I've read about other encounters, looked at photos and videos, but nothing quite matches what I experienced. Sometimes I wonder if that thing is still out there, still watching from behind trees, still avoiding detection. But mostly, I wonder how many other people have stories like mine that they're afraid to tell. I've never been a believer in the supernatural or conspiracy theories. I'm just a regular guy who saw something I can't explain. I don't know what it was. Maybe it was what people call Bigfoot. Maybe it was something else entirely. All I know is what I saw that night was real, and it changed how I look at the world forever. The strangest part? Sometimes, especially on cold winter nights when the moon is full, I find myself missing those solo rides through the woods. Part of me even wishes I could go back to that moment, maybe handle it differently, stay longer, try to communicate somehow. But then I remember those eyes, that intelligent, calculating look, and I know I made the right choice in getting out of there. I still have questions that I know will never be answered. Why was it there? Was it watching me before I noticed it? Had it been following me? Where did it go? But maybe some things are better left unknown. All I know is that whatever I saw that night in Gladwin County was real, and no amount of time or rational explanation will ever convince me otherwise. Story 8. It happened in the summer of '78 in Livingston County, Michigan. I was 16 at the time, and Mike was 17. We'd spent most of that Saturday at our friend Dave's house playing cards and listening to the new Boston album. Nothing special, just a normal summer day. Dave lived out on the outskirts of town, where the houses got further apart and the woods started taking over. We left around 6:30 p.m. The sun was still up. You know how summer evenings are, when the light seems to stretch on forever. Mike was driving his dad's old Chevy Nova. I remember it was this ugly shade of brown, but Mike loved that car like it was a Ferrari or something. We were taking Allen Road home, which was this winding country road that cut through farmland and patches of forest. The radio was playing some song I can't remember, and we were talking about this girl Mike had a crush on at school. Just normal teenage stuff. That's what makes what happened next so surreal. How ordinary everything was right up until it wasn't. We'd just made the turn east on Allen when Mike suddenly slowed down. At first, I thought he'd seen a deer. That wouldn't have been unusual. We saw them all the time out there. But then I saw what he was looking at, and my blood went cold. About 200 feet ahead of us, something was running toward the road from the field on our right. At first glance, I thought it was a kid, but something was off about the way it moved. It was running on 2 legs, but the movement was different, more fluid, more powerful. It was covered in dark brown hair or fur, not like a coat or costume, but actual fur growing from its body. What the hell is that? Mike's voice was barely a whisper. We were both leaning forward in our seats, the car now crawling along at maybe 5 mph. The thing, and I don't know what else to call it, was about 5 feet tall. Looking back now, that's what strikes me as the strangest part. It wasn't some huge, towering monster like you hear about in most Bigfoot stories. It was small, almost like a child version of what people describe. But there was nothing childlike about the way it moved. As we watched, it reached one of those metal cattle fences, you know, the kind made of horizontal pipes, about 4.5 feet high. Without breaking stride, without even seeming to gather itself for the jump, it just leaped, cleared that fence like it was stepping over a crack in the sidewalk. I've played sports all my life, and I've never seen a human move like that. The power-to-size ratio was just wrong, all wrong. The worst part was when it landed on the other side. It turned its head toward our car, and even though we were still a good distance away, I could feel it looking at us. The sun was behind it, so I couldn't make out any facial features, but I knew it was aware of us. My skin was crawling, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. You know that feeling when you're alone in the dark, and you're absolutely certain someone's watching you. It was like that, but 100 times worse. Mike had stopped the car completely by this point. Neither of us said a word. The creature stood there for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds. Then it turned and sprinted toward the tree line on the left side of the road. The way it ran, I've tried to describe it to people before, but I can never quite capture it. It was almost like watching an Olympic sprinter, but with a fluidity that seemed impossible for its frame. When it reached the trees, it disappeared, just like that. No rustling branches, no sound at all. 1 second it was there, the next it vanished into the shadows under the trees. We sat there in silence for maybe a minute. The radio was still playing, some commercial for a local car dealership, and it felt so absurdly normal that it almost made me laugh. Almost. "Did you—" Mike started. "Yeah," I cut him off. "I saw it." He pressed the gas pedal slowly, and we drove past the spot where it had crossed. I kept my eyes fixed on the tree line, half expecting it to burst out at us, but there was nothing, just the early evening shadows between the trunks. We drove the rest of the way home in silence. When Mike dropped me off, we finally talked about it, tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was someone in a costume, but who could jump like that? Maybe it was some kind of escaped exotic pet, but walking on 2 legs. We went through every logical explanation we could think of, but none of them fit what we'd seen. The next day, we drove back out there in broad daylight, looked around the area, checked for footprints or broken branches. We found nothing. The ground was too hard and dry to hold prints, and if it had left any other signs of its passing, we couldn't spot them. We told Dave about it the next time we saw him, but I could tell he didn't believe us. Can't blame him. I wouldn't have believed it either if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. After a while, we stopped talking about it altogether. What was the point? We knew what we saw, but we also knew how crazy it sounded. That was 46 years ago, and I still think about it all the time. Every few years, Mike and I will get together, have a few beers, and talk about that evening. We've both had full lives, careers, marriages, kids, but that moment on Allen Road stays with us. Sometimes I'll be driving down a country road at dusk, and I'll catch myself scanning the tree line, wondering if I'll see something move with that impossible grace again. I've read other people's encounters with Bigfoot over the years, but most of them describe these huge 7 or 8 foot tall creatures. Whatever we saw that day was different, smaller, but somehow that made it more unsettling, more real. Like seeing a young one implied there were adults around somewhere, watching, staying hidden. I still live in Michigan, though not in Livingston County anymore. Sometimes I think about driving back to that stretch of Allen Road, just to see if it feels the same. But I never have. Part of me doesn't want to know if the area has changed, if they've cut down those woods or built houses there. And part of me, if I'm being honest, is afraid of what I might see if I did go back. I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything. I'm just telling you what I saw on a normal summer evening in 1978. Make of it what you will. But if you're ever driving down a lonely road in Michigan and you see something moving in a way that doesn't quite make sense, don't stop. Just keep driving. Story 9. I was 23 at the time, a single mom driving through Michigan's Upper Peninsula with my 18-month-old son, Tommy. We were moving from Milwaukee to stay with my sister in Marquette after my divorce. Money was tight, so I was trying to do the whole drive in one shot to save on motel costs. Looking back, that was probably my first mistake. It was late October, and the weather was getting colder. The US 2 highway was pretty much deserted that time of night. I'd been driving for hours, and Tommy had finally fallen asleep in his car seat. Around 11 p.m., I started feeling dangerously drowsy. You know that feeling when your eyes keep closing no matter how hard you fight it? I knew I needed to stop before I crashed. I remember seeing a sign for a roadside picnic area and pulling in. It was just a small gravel lot with a couple of picnic tables and trash bins surrounded by dense forest. The kind of place that probably sees decent traffic during summer days, but feels completely isolated at night. There was a single light pole, but it was burnt out. I made sure all the doors were locked, something my dad always insisted on, and reclined my seat a bit. Tommy was sleeping peacefully, and I figured a quick power nap would help me make it the rest of the way. I left the key in the ignition so I could run the heater occasionally since the temperature was dropping. The last time I checked my watch, it was about 11:20 p.m. I must have fallen into a deeper sleep than I planned. What woke me was the smell. God, that smell. If you've ever driven past roadkill that's been baking in the sun for days, imagine that but 10 times worse. It was this overwhelming stench of decay and wet dog, and something else I can't even describe. It hit me so suddenly that my first thought was that something had crawled under the car and died. The car was cold. The engine had stopped running while I slept. When I tried to check my watch, I couldn't make out the numbers in the darkness. Something felt wrong. You know that feeling when you're being watched? It was like that, but 100 times stronger. Every hair on my body was standing on end. I reached for the interior light switch with trembling fingers. What I saw in that moment. I'm getting chills just typing this. There was this massive shape looming over the hood of my car. At first, my brain couldn't even process what I was seeing. It was like my mind was desperately trying to make it into something familiar. A bear, maybe, or some kind of optical illusion from the trees and shadows. But then it moved, and I saw its face. The creature was enormous, at least 7 feet tall, even hunched over as it was. It was covered in dark brown hair, not fur exactly, but more like human hair, just longer and coarser. But the face, God, the face is what still haunts my nightmares. It was almost human-like, but wrong somehow. The nose was flattened, but definitely nose-shaped, not like an ape's. The mouth was wide and filled with teeth that looked yellowish in the dome light. But the eyes were what made my blood run cold. They were huge and round, reflecting the light like a cat's eyes do at night, but with an intelligence behind them that was unmistakably conscious. They weren't the eyes of an animal. There was something knowing in them, something almost human, but not quite. The thing that still makes my skin crawl to this day is how it was looking at Tommy. Not at me, though I was frozen in absolute terror, but at my baby. It had its massive hands planted on the hood of my car, and its face was maybe 2 feet from the windshield, just staring at him. Tommy had woken up, but he wasn't crying. He was completely silent, staring right back at this creature with wide eyes. I couldn't move, I couldn't scream, I couldn't even breathe. I just sat there, my hand still on the light switch, watching this impossible thing have what felt like a staring contest with my son. The whole time, that putrid smell was so strong I could taste it in the back of my throat. I don't know how long we sat there like that. It felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. Then Tommy did something that still makes my heart stop when I think about it. He smiled and reached toward the windshield, like he wanted to touch the creature. The thing's expression changed. I swear to God something shifted in its face. It wasn't a smile exactly, but something in those eyes. It was like recognition or curiosity. Then it slowly lifted one hand from the hood and pressed it against the windshield, directly opposite where Tommy's tiny hand was reaching. That's when my paralysis broke. Pure maternal instinct took over, and I lunged for the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and the headlights came on, illuminating the creature in their glare. For a split second, I saw it full on, its massive shoulders, the way its arms were too long for its body, the matted hair covering every inch of it, except that terrifyingly almost human face. Then it moved with a speed that something that size shouldn't have been capable of. One moment it was there, and the next it had vanished into the darkness beyond the headlights. I threw the car into reverse, and got out of there so fast I'm surprised I didn't leave tire tracks in the gravel. I drove the rest of the way to Marquette without stopping, my hands shaking on the wheel the whole time. Tommy fell back asleep like nothing had happened, but I kept checking the rearview mirror, convinced I'd see that thing following us. When I finally told my sister what happened, she thought I'd fallen asleep and had a nightmare. Maybe part of me wanted to believe that too. But I know what I saw. That smell lingered in my car for weeks, no matter how many times I cleaned it. And there were 2 distinct handprints on my hood. Huge ones, much bigger than any humans, that didn't wash off until I had the car repainted months later. I've never gone back to that stretch of US 2, and I've never driven alone at night through the UP since then. Tommy doesn't remember any of it. He was too young. But sometimes I wonder about that moment, when he and that creature seemed to connect somehow. What did he see that I didn't? What did it want? I've read about other Bigfoot sightings over the years, but I've never heard of one quite like my experience. Most stories talk about them running away or acting aggressive, not whatever that was. Sometimes I wonder if anyone else has seen what I saw. Not just a glimpse of something in the woods, but a face-to-face encounter with something that seemed almost curious. I still drive past roadside rest stops sometimes, and every single time I get a whiff of something that reminds me of that night. It's probably just my imagination, but I can't help checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those eyes again. I never stop at rest areas at night anymore. Some lessons you only need to learn once. That's my story. I know how it sounds. Believe me, I do. If someone had told me this before it happened, I would have thought they were crazy or making it up. But I know what I saw that night. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I find myself wondering if somewhere in those Michigan forests, that creature is still out there, maybe wondering about us too. Story 10. It was November 1978, and I was 13 years old. Growing up in Kent County, Michigan meant hunting was just part of life. My dad had taught me everything about hunting since I was old enough to hold a rifle, and that year I was finally allowed to go deer hunting on my own. I had my trusty Marlin 35 that my grandfather had passed down to me, and I knew every inch of those woods like the back of my hand. That morning started like any other hunting day. I woke up well before dawn, bundled up in my warmest clothes. It had snowed the night before, and the temperature was hovering around 20 degrees. I remember my mom insisting I wear an extra layer and pack some hot chocolate in my thermos. Looking back, I'm grateful for that thermos. It was probably the only thing that kept me from completely freezing that day. I had a favorite spot in an old cornfield that backed up against the forest. The farmers had already harvested, leaving only stubble poking through the fresh snow. It was perfect, because deer would often emerge from the tree line to scavenge for leftover corn. I'd set up there dozens of times before without incident. I got to my spot while it was still dark and settled in. I had a simple folding camping chair, nothing fancy like the hunting blinds kids use these days. Just me, my rifle, and the crisp morning air. The sun started rising around 7:30, painting everything in that pale winter light that makes the snow look almost blue. The first couple of hours passed uneventfully. I saw a few does in the distance, but nothing worth taking a shot at. Around 10 a.m., something changed. I can't really explain it, but the woods just felt different. You know that feeling when you're alone in a room, but suddenly you're absolutely certain someone's watching you? It was like that, but 100 times stronger. The birds had gone quiet. I hadn't even noticed when it happened, but suddenly I realized I couldn't hear a single chickadee or nuthatch. Even the wind seemed to die down. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and my heart started racing. I had this overwhelming urge to turn around and look toward the tree line behind me. When I finally did turn, I nearly dropped my rifle. About 60 yards away, standing right at the edge of the forest, was something I still struggled to describe. It was massive, easily 7 feet tall, maybe more. The thing that struck me most was its build. I'd love to say it looked like a man in a suit, or that my eyes were playing tricks on me. But this thing was just wrong. Too big, too broad, with proportions that didn't make sense for any animal I knew. It was covered in dark brown hair, probably 6 or 7 inches long, that moved slightly in the winter breeze. The face was lighter colored, almost a dirty beige, with deep-set eyes that I swear looked almost human. But it was the way it was standing that really got to me. Completely upright like a person, but with shoulders that must have been twice as wide as my dad's. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold my rifle. I managed to raise it, not to shoot. I wasn't even thinking about that, but to look through the scope. Through the 4x magnification, I could see it even clearer. Its chest was moving up and down with steady breaths that came out as steam in the cold air. The hair on its face was shorter than on the rest of its body, and there was something about its eyes. They weren't animal eyes. There was an intelligence there that made my blood run cold. For what felt like forever, but was probably only about 3 minutes, we just looked at each other. It made no aggressive moves, didn't come closer, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching me as intently as I was watching it. I remember thinking how strange it was that I wasn't more afraid. I mean, I was terrified, but not in the way you'd expect when facing something that could probably tear you in half without breaking a sweat. Then it shifted its weight slightly, and that spell was broken. Pure panic hit me like a truck. I scrambled to my feet, dropping my thermos in the snow. I didn't even think about grabbing it. I just ran. I ran faster than I'd ever run in my life, my boots crunching through the snow, my breath coming in ragged gasps that burned my lungs in the cold air. I didn't stop running until I reached my bike, which I'd left chained to a tree near the old logging road about half a mile away. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the lock. The whole time, I kept expecting to hear footsteps behind me, to feel a massive hand grab my shoulder. But there was nothing. Just the sound of my own panicked breathing and my heart threatening to burst out of my chest. I rode home in a daze, pedaling as fast as I could, even though my legs felt like jelly. When I got home, my mom took one look at my face and knew something was wrong. I told her I'd gotten spooked by what I thought was a bear. I couldn't bring myself to tell her what I'd really seen. I could barely admit it to myself. It took me 3 days to work up the courage to go back for my thermos. My dad went with me, probably thinking I was being silly about the bear. The thermos was right where I'd dropped it, half buried in fresh snow. There were no tracks around it except for my own from that day. The new snow had covered everything else. I never went hunting in that spot again. In fact, I didn't go hunting alone for the next 2 years. When I did start going out solo again, I always made sure to set up with my back against something solid, where nothing could sneak up behind me. The thing that's bothered me most over the years isn't the fear I felt that day. It's the questions. Why didn't it do anything? Was it just as curious about me as I was about it? I'd never heard anything about Bigfoot in Michigan before that day, and I didn't know anyone else who had seen anything like it. But I know what I saw. That wasn't a bear, wasn't a man in a suit, wasn't my imagination. It was something else, something that shouldn't exist but does. I'm 58 now, and I've never seen anything like it again. Sometimes I almost convince myself it was just a teenager's overactive imagination. But then I remember those eyes, that intelligent gaze, and I know it was real. I've gone over that morning thousands of times in my head, and every detail is still as clear as if it happened yesterday. I still hunt, still spend time in the woods. But something changed in me that day. I realized that maybe we don't know everything about our world, that there are things out there we can't explain. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I wonder if somewhere in the forests of Michigan that creature is still out there, watching other unsuspecting hunters from the tree line, just like it watched me on that cold November morning in 1978. The weirdest part. Sometimes I wish I could see it again, not to prove anything to anyone else, but just to know for sure that I'm not crazy, that what I saw that day was real. But maybe some things are better left as mysteries. All I know is that every time I hear someone dismiss Bigfoot stories as hoaxes or imagination, I think back to those 3 minutes in that snow-covered cornfield, and I keep my mouth shut. Because how do you explain something that shouldn't exist, but does? Story 11. My wife Nancy and I were experienced hunters in Michigan's backcountry. We'd been tracking deer in Iosco County for over a decade, so when we found blood trails in the snow on New Year's Eve, we knew we had to go back the next morning. It wasn't just about hunting. We hated the thought of leaving a wounded animal to suffer. We headed out around 5:30 a.m. on New Year's Day. The snow was deep that year, probably the heaviest we'd seen in years. The temperature was hovering around 15 degrees, and our breath came out in thick clouds. The full moon reflected off the snow so brightly that we barely needed our flashlights. We parked our old Ford pickup near the abandoned stretch of US 23. Nobody used that road anymore, which made it perfect for hunting. The snow was about knee-deep, and every step made that distinct crunching sound that seems louder in the pre-dawn silence. We were following the blood trail from the previous day, though the fresh snowfall had mostly covered it. Around 6 a.m., the sky was starting to lighten just enough to give everything that weird blue-gray winter morning color. We'd gone about half a mile into the swamp, and I remember thinking how quiet everything was. Usually, you'd hear birds starting to wake up, maybe some small animals moving around. But there was nothing, just our footsteps in the snow. I was checking some tracks when Nancy grabbed my arm. At first, I thought she'd spotted our wounded deer, but when I looked at her face, something was wrong. She was staring straight ahead, and her hand was shaking on my sleeve. That's when I saw it. About 50 yards ahead, something dark was moving between the trees. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it. Maybe it was a bear, but bears don't walk upright like that, and they sure as hell aren't that tall. This thing, this creature, it had to be at least 8 feet tall. I'm 6'2", and I could see its head brushing against branches that would have been a good 2 feet above me. The thing that really got me was how it moved. It wasn't clumsy or awkward like you'd expect something that big to be. It moved smoothly, purposefully, like it knew exactly where it was going. Its arms were long, way too long, and they swung slightly as it walked. The whole body was covered in thick, dark hair that looked almost black against the snow. I've been a hunter all my life. I know every animal in Michigan's forests. This wasn't anything I'd ever seen before. It wasn't a guy in a suit either. The proportions were all wrong, and nobody could fake that kind of movement in deep snow. The creature was moving diagonally across our path, getting closer with each step. The logical part of my brain was screaming at me to raise my rifle, but I couldn't move. It's hard to explain, but there was this overwhelming sense of wrongness, like seeing something that shouldn't exist. Nancy's fingers dug into my arm and she whispered, "We need to go. Now." Her voice was barely audible, but in that dead silence it felt too loud. The creature stopped, just stopped dead in its tracks. I swear my heart stopped too. It turned its head toward us, and even though I couldn't make out its face clearly in the dim light, I knew it was looking right at us. The way it moved its head was so human-like. That's what made it even more terrifying. We started backing away slowly, trying not to make sudden movements. The snow that had been so beautiful earlier now felt like concrete around our feet, making each step backwards painfully slow. The creature didn't move, just stood there watching us. That's when I noticed the smell, like wet dog mixed with something rotten. About 20 feet into our retreat, Nancy stumbled slightly. It wasn't much, just a small sound of crunching snow, but it was enough. The creature made this sound, not quite a growl, not quite a grunt, something that made every hair on my body stand up. Then it took a step toward us. That's when we ran. We just turned and ran as fast as we could through that deep snow. I've never been more scared in my life. Every few seconds, I expected to feel something grab me from behind. The sound of our panicked breathing and the crunching snow seemed impossibly loud. Looking back, I don't know how we made it to the truck so fast. Adrenaline, I guess. We practically fell into the cab, and I had trouble getting the key in the ignition because my hands were shaking so bad. As we drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, but all I could see was the empty road and swirling snow. We didn't talk about it for days. What could we say? We both knew what we'd seen, but it didn't make any sense. Nancy finally brought it up about a week later, and we agreed on the details, the height, the movement, the way it looked at us. We never went back to that part of the swamp again. I've read about other sightings over the years, but I've never shared our story until now. Some people might think we imagined it or exaggerated what we saw. All I know is that something was in those woods that morning, something that shouldn't have been there, something that I can't explain. Every time I hear branches cracking in the woods at night or catch an odd smell on the wind, I remember that morning, and I wonder if it's still out there, walking through the Michigan wilderness. Sometimes I wonder if anyone else has seen it in that same area. The strange thing is, that stretch of US 23 was rerouted a few years later, and the swamp was partially drained for development. Maybe that's why we never heard of any other sightings in that specific location, but I know what we saw. Even now, 45 years later, I can close my eyes and see that dark figure moving through the trees, and I get that same feeling of absolute terror. I still hunt, but never alone, and never in that part of the county. Some things you just don't mess with. Whatever was in those woods that New Year's morning, it didn't belong to our world, and I hope I never see anything like it again. Story 12. I was 27 then, working at the paper mill and spending my weekends riding my brand new Ski-Doo Olympic through the backcountry. Nothing fancy, but it was my pride and joy, and it got me where I needed to go. That particular Sunday started like any other winter day in the UP. Cold as hell, probably around 15 degrees, with thick snow covering everything in sight. I'd been cooped up all week due to some nasty weather, so when the sky cleared a bit that afternoon, I jumped at the chance to get out. Around 2:30, I loaded up my sled with some basic supplies, thermos of coffee, couple sandwiches, basic toolkit, you know, the usual stuff for a few hours' ride. The plan was to check out some of the remote trails east of town, near the old logging roads. The snow that year was something else. Must have been close to 30 inches on the ground, with this weird, crusty layer on top that was actually strong enough to hold my snowmobile in most places. It made for some great riding conditions, even if the sky was starting to cloud over again. I'd been out for maybe an hour, working my way through some pine ridges and marshy areas, when I decided to take a break and have some coffee. That's when I noticed something odd about the snow ahead of me. At first I thought maybe someone else had been through there on foot, which would have been strange enough given how remote the area was. But as I got closer, my blood ran cold. There, perfectly preserved in that crusty snow, was a line of footprints. Not boot prints, not snowshoe tracks, bare footprints. And they were massive, had to be at least 16 inches long, maybe more. The detail in them was what really got to me. You could see every toe impression, the arch, the heel, everything. They were deep, too, breaking right through that hard crust that was supporting my 400-pound machine. I've been a hunter all my life. I've tracked every kind of animal that lives in these woods. These weren't animal tracks. They were human-shaped, but wrong. Too big, way too big. And the stride length between them must have been at least 4 feet. I killed the engine and just sat there for a while, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. The wind was picking up from the northwest, making the pine branches creak above me. It was around 3 p.m., still plenty of light, but something felt different now. You know that feeling when you suddenly realize you're not alone? That prickling sensation on the back of your neck. Yeah, that's what hit me. I decided to follow the tracks for a bit. Probably the dumbest decision I've ever made, but curiosity got the better of me. They led through a dense stand of pines and into a boggy area. The stride length was consistent, and what really struck me was how purposeful they seemed. Whatever made these wasn't wandering around. It was headed somewhere specific. After following them for maybe a quarter mile, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The tracks I was following, they were fresh, real fresh. The edges were still sharp, no drift snow in them yet, despite the wind. That's when I heard it. It's hard to describe the sound. Kind of like a tree creaking in the wind, but deeper, more deliberate. And it came from behind me. I froze, my hand still on the snowmobile's handlebar. The wind had died down completely, and in that moment, the woods were dead silent. No birds, no nothing. Then came the smell. If you've ever driven past a really rank swamp in the middle of summer, it was kind of like that. but mixed with something else, something musky and wild. My eyes were darting everywhere, searching the tree line. The pines were thick enough that visibility was maybe 50 feet at best. That's when I saw movement through the trees. Just a shadow at first, but it was big, too big to be a bear, especially in February. And it was upright. I caught a glimpse of dark, matted something. Fur? Hair? I don't know. But it was moving parallel to my position, about 40 yards out. I'd love to tell you I did something brave or clever, but the truth is, I panicked. I yanked the starter cord so hard I thought I might break it. The engine roared to life and I heard, well, I guess you'd call it a response. It was like a grunt, but so deep and powerful I could feel it in my chest. Then there was movement, fast movement, headed my way. I didn't stick around to see what it was. I cranked the throttle and got out of there as fast as that old skidoo would take me. The whole ride back, I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced something was following me. I didn't slow down until I hit the main road. Here's the thing that still bothers me. When I got home and calmed down enough to think straight, I realized something. Those tracks, they were headed straight toward town. I called the sheriff's office the next morning, but by then we'd had fresh snow. When I tried to take them out to the spot, I couldn't even find it again. The whole area looked different in the daylight. That was 52 years ago, and I've never seen anything like it since. I still ride those trails sometimes, never alone anymore. But that part of the woods feels different to me now. Sometimes, especially on quiet winter afternoons when the clouds roll in, I swear I can still smell that swampy, musky odor on the wind. I don't know what I saw that day. I don't claim to. But I know what I felt, what I smelled, and what I heard. And those footprints, they were real. Whatever made them was real. I just hope I never find out exactly how real. The strangest part? A week later, I heard some folks from the other side of the county talking about weird noises and missing livestock. But by then, the snow had melted enough that any evidence was long gone. It's like whatever it was just passed through our area and vanished, leaving nothing but questions and a handful of scared people who, like me, mostly keep their stories to themselves. Story 13. It was late July, and my parents had decided to take advantage of the warm weather with a family picnic at the lake. My younger sister Sarah was 8, and she was going through this phase where she collected interesting rocks and shells. Mom and Dad thought the beach would be perfect for her hobby, while giving us all a chance to cool off in the water. We arrived at the lake around 4 p.m. The sun was still high, but the worst of the day's heat had passed. The beach wasn't crowded, just a few other families scattered here and there, mostly packing up to leave. We found a nice spot near a grove of pine trees that offered some shade. Dad spread out the blanket, while Mom started unpacking our picnic basket. Everything was normal at first. Sarah and I splashed in the shallows while our parents set up. The water was cold, Lake Superior always is, but it felt amazing after the drive up. We must have played for about an hour before Mom called us in for sandwiches and lemonade. That's when Dad noticed the footprints. He almost choked on his sandwich when he saw them. At first, I didn't understand what the big deal was. There were lots of footprints on the beach. But these were different. They came out of the tree line about 30 feet from our blanket, went down to the water's edge, and then back into the woods. "Helen, come look at this," Dad called to Mom, trying to keep his voice casual, but I could hear the tension in it. I followed them over to look. I'll never forget those prints. Each one was easily twice the size of my dad's foot, and he wore a size 11. They were deep, too. Whatever made them was heavy. The strangest part was how human they looked, just massive. You could clearly see 5 toes, a heel, an arch, but the proportions were all wrong. Mom tried to laugh it off. "Probably some college kids playing a prank," she said, but her voice wavered. "You know how those Northern Michigan University students can be." Dad shook his head. No way, Helen. Look at how deep these are. Whatever made these was heavy, really heavy. The sun was starting to get lower in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. That's when we heard it, a sound I still hear in my nightmares sometimes. It started like an owl's hoot, but transformed into something else entirely. The closest thing I can compare it to is when we visited the Detroit Zoo and heard the orangutans calling to each other, but this was deeper, louder, more primal. Sarah grabbed Mom's hand. What was that? Before anyone could answer, we heard movement in the trees. Heavy movement. Whatever it was big enough to make the branches shake. Then the jumping started. Thud, thud, thud. Something massive was jumping up and down just inside the tree line, maybe 50 feet from us. The ground actually trembled. I remember watching Mom's half-full lemonade glass vibrating on the picnic blanket like that scene from Jurassic Park, except this was real, and it was happening to us. Dad quickly moved between us and the trees. "Pack up," he said quietly but firmly. "Now." We started throwing everything into the picnic basket as fast as we could. The jumping continued, moving parallel to us as we gathered our things. Whatever it was, it seemed to be trying to intimidate us into leaving. That's when the smell hit us, like wet dog mixed with rotting vegetation and something else I couldn't identify. It was overwhelming. Sarah started to cry. As we hurried toward the parking lot, I made the mistake of looking back. The sun was behind the trees now, but I saw something move between two pines. Something massive. It had to be at least 8 feet tall. The shape was vaguely human, but broader, more muscular. I only saw it for a split second, but that was enough. The creature let out another one of those horrible screams, closer this time. We ran the rest of the way to the car. Dad's hands were shaking so badly he could barely get the key in the ignition. As we drove away, I looked out the back window. There, at the edge of the trees, I saw a dark figure step partially out of the shadows. Even from that distance, I could tell it was watching us leave. Then it stepped back into the forest and disappeared. The ride home was almost completely silent. Sarah had fallen asleep, exhausted from crying. Mom kept saying it must have been college students playing a prank, but she didn't sound convinced. Dad didn't say anything at all. A few days later, there was an article in the mining journal about a couple who had seen what they described as a Bigfoot in the same area. The man said it was at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark brown hair, and moved with an unsettling mix of human and ape-like characteristics. Reading their description, I felt sick to my stomach. It matched exactly what I'd glimpsed. I'm 64 now, and I've never gone back to that beach. My parents refused to talk about what happened that day. Sarah claims she doesn't remember it, but she's never taken her own kids anywhere near Lake Superior. Sometimes I try to convince myself it was just a bear, or that Mom was right about college students playing a prank. But then I remember those footprints, so human yet so wrong, and that horrible scream, and I know what we encountered was something else entirely. I still live in Michigan, but I stick to the lower peninsula these days. Sometimes when I'm up late at night and the wind is blowing through the trees outside my window, I swear I can hear that scream again, echoing across 50 years of memory. And I wonder if it's still out there, hiding in the forests around Lake Superior, waiting for another family to stumble into its territory. The weirdest part? Every few years I hear about similar encounters in that same area. Same footprints, same screams, same intimidation tactics. Whatever we saw that day, we weren't the first to encounter it, and we certainly weren't the last. I've never been able to explain what happened that day. The rational part of my brain wants to dismiss it, but the footprints were real. The screams were real. The figure I saw was real. Sometimes I wish we had taken pictures. But in 1972, people didn't carry cameras everywhere like they do now. and honestly, we were too terrified to think about documentation. Last year, my grandson asked me if I believed in Bigfoot. I didn't know how to answer him. How do you explain to a child that sometimes the things we dismiss as impossible are actually out there, hiding in the shadows of our rational world? How do you tell them that monsters might be real after all? All I know is that something was in those woods that day. Something that didn't want us there. Something that wasn't supposed to exist. And while I can't prove what I saw, I know what I experienced was real. The memory is as clear today as it was 50 years ago, and it still makes my heart race when I think about it. I don't expect anyone to believe this story. I'm not sure I would believe it myself if I hadn't lived it. But I know what I saw, what my family experienced, and I know that somewhere in the forests around Lake Superior, something is still out there. Something that walks on two legs, leaves massive footprints in the sand, and screams into the twilight like a creature that time forgot. Sometimes I wonder if it remembers us too. Story 14. I've been holding this story inside for almost 50 years now, and I still get goosebumps every time I think about what happened that night in Ann Arbor. It was the summer of 1974, and I was 32 at the time, living with my wife Sarah and our two kids, Tommy, 8, and Lisa, 6. We had this amazing German shepherd named Rex, the bravest, most protective dog you could imagine. He was basically a third child to us, always watching over the kids while they played in the yard. That night started like any other summer evening in Michigan. The sun was setting, and it was still pretty warm outside. You know, one of those perfect July nights where you just want to be outdoors. We had this routine of taking family walks after dinner, usually around our neighborhood near Packard and Carpenter Roads in Pittsfield Township. Rex absolutely lived for these walks, always leading the way and checking back on us every few minutes like he was making sure his flock was safe. We headed out around 8:30 p.m. The sky was that deep blue color you get just before true darkness sets in, and there was still enough light to see without flashlights. The kids were in front of us, playing their usual game of stepping only on certain colored patches of gravel, and Sarah and I were walking hand in hand behind them. Rex was doing his normal patrol, trotting ahead and then circling back. The first thing that felt off was Rex's behavior. We were passing by this wooded area we'd walked past hundreds of times before, and suddenly he just changed. If you've ever owned a German shepherd, you know they're like furry tanks, fearless and always ready to protect. But Rex started walking closer to us, and I noticed his tail wasn't up in its usual confident position. He kept looking into the woods, and his ears were twitching like radar dishes. I remember thinking maybe there was a deer or something in there, but deep down, something felt wrong. The kids were still playing their game, completely oblivious, but Sarah squeezed my hand. She'd noticed it too. Then we heard it, this sound of branches breaking maybe 30-40 feet into the tree line. Not like when a squirrel or raccoon moves through the brush. These were big branches, the kind that make that sharp crack when they break. The sound seemed to be keeping pace with us as we walked. I stopped the kids' game and called them closer. "Stay near Mom and Dad," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. But Rex's behavior was getting worse. His tail was now completely tucked between his legs, something I'd never seen him do before, and he was pressing himself against my leg as we walked. The breaking branches would stop when we stopped and start up again when we moved. It was like whatever was in there was playing some kind of game with us. I wanted to convince myself it was just some local kids messing around, but there was this presence. You know that feeling when you're being watched? It was like that, but 100 times stronger. Then the smell hit us. If you've ever driven past roadkill that's been baking in the summer sun for a few days, it was like that but worse. It was this overwhelming stench of decay mixed with something musky and animal-like. Lisa started gagging, and Tommy covered his nose with his shirt. Sarah pulled both kids close to her, and I could feel Rex trembling against my leg. I'm not a small guy. I worked construction back then and could handle myself pretty well. But something about that moment made me feel incredibly vulnerable. We were about a quarter-mile from the nearest house, and it was getting darker by the minute. The cracking sounds were getting closer to the tree line now, maybe 15-20 feet in. Rex let out this low growl, but it wasn't his usual protective growl. It was higher-pitched, almost fearful. The hair along his spine was standing straight up. Then we heard this sound. I've spent decades trying to figure out how to describe it. It wasn't quite a growl, wasn't quite a breath. It was deep, like something coming from a massive chest cavity. The closest thing I can compare it to is the sound a horse makes when it's clearing its nose, but deeper and longer. It seemed to come from about 7 or 8 feet off the ground. The kids started crying quietly, and Sarah was shushing them, telling them everything was okay. But Rex just lost it. He started backing away, pulling so hard on his leash that I almost lost my grip. This was our protective family dog, the one who once chased off a black bear that got into our trash, and he was trying desperately to get away. I picked up Lisa, and Sarah grabbed Tommy's hand. We started walking faster, trying not to run, but definitely not maintaining our casual pace anymore. The breaking branches followed us, staying parallel. Whatever it was big enough that we could hear its movements displacing air through the leaves and branches. Then there was this moment, and I swear on everything I hold dear that this happened, where the moon broke through the clouds and lit up the tree line. Just for a second, I saw something move between 2 large oaks. It was massive, easily 7 feet tall, and wrong. The proportions were all wrong. The shoulders were too wide, the arms too long. It wasn't a bear. Bears don't stand like that, don't move like that. I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything. I'm just telling you what I saw. It was dark, and I was scared out of my mind, but I know what I saw moving between those trees. It wasn't human, and it wasn't any animal I'd ever seen in Michigan's woods. We made it home in record time. Rex refused to go out in the backyard for his usual bedtime bathroom break. He just stood at the door, whining. The kids slept in our room that night, and Rex stayed right there with us, something he'd never done before. The next day, I went back with 2 of my buddies from work. We found broken branches high up, way higher than a person could reach, and some weird prints in a muddy area. They were like huge footprints, but rain had fallen that morning and made them too distorted to really make anything out. This all happened 50 years ago, and I've never had another experience like it. We moved away from that area a few years later, partly because Sarah never felt comfortable walking in the neighborhood again. Rex never returned to his old self on walks. He was always more cautious, more alert, especially near wooded areas. I'm 82 now, and I've had a lot of time to think about what happened that night. I've read about other people's encounters in Michigan over the years, and some of them sound eerily similar to what we experienced. I don't know what was in those woods that night. I don't claim to know for sure what it was. But I know what it wasn't. It wasn't a bear, wasn't a person, wasn't any known animal that should have been in those Michigan woods. Rex passed away many years ago, but I'll never forget how he acted that night. Dogs know things we don't, sense things we can't, and whatever was in those woods that night was something that turned the bravest dog I've ever known into a trembling, fearful animal. I still think about it sometimes, especially on summer nights, when the moon is bright and I hear branches breaking in the distance, some things you just can't explain, and some memories never fade, no matter how many years pass. Story 15. It was late July 1950, and I was helping my mama with the blueberry picking like we did every summer. I was just 13 then, and our family had a secret spot deep in the woods where the berries grew sweeter and bigger than anywhere else. Times were tough after the war, and those berries meant extra money when we sold them at the general store in town. That evening, Mama had gone home early with a bad headache, leaving me to finish up. I wasn't scared. I knew those woods like the back of my hand, having grown up playing there with my brothers. The sun was getting low, but I figured I had another half hour of good light left. I wanted to fill just one more bucket before heading home. I remember everything about that moment so clearly. The air was thick and humid, typical Minnesota summer weather. Mosquitoes were starting to come out, and I could hear the evening birds making their last calls. The woods were starting to get that golden glow that happens just before sunset, making everything look kind of magical. I was reaching deep into this huge blueberry bush, trying to get the berries way in the back that nobody else could reach, when the hair on the back of my neck stood up. You know that feeling when someone's watching you? It was like that, but 100 times stronger. My whole body just froze. At first, I tried to tell myself it was just a deer. We had plenty of those around, and they'd often come close if you stayed still enough. But this felt different. The air seemed to get heavier, and there was this smell, like wet dog mixed with something rotten. I'd never smelled anything like it before or since. That's when I heard it, this rustling sound from another blueberry bush about 30 feet away. I turned my head real slow, trying not to make any sudden movements. Through the branches, I could see something crouched down. At first, I thought maybe it was my brother Tommy playing a trick on me. But then, whatever it was, shifted its weight, and the whole bush moved like someone had dropped a boulder on it. No person could move that much vegetation just by shifting around. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I started backing away real slow, still holding my berry bucket because I was too scared to even think about dropping it. That's when I made the biggest mistake. I looked back over my shoulder. There it was, standing by a huge oak tree. I say standing, but this thing was massive, had to be at least 8 feet tall. It looked like a man, but was covered in dark, matted hair. The sun was behind it, so I couldn't see its face clearly, thank God, but I could see its arms. Those arms were so long they hung down past its knees, and they were thick as tree trunks. I don't remember deciding to run. My legs just started moving on their own. I dropped that bucket of berries and ran faster than I ever had in my life. Behind me, I could hear it moving through the woods, breaking branches and making this weird huffing sound. The worst part was that it wasn't running full speed. It was like it was pacing me, staying just far enough behind that I couldn't see it clearly when I glanced back. The thing that still haunts me is how it moved. Despite its size, it was agile, weaving between trees like it knew exactly where each one was, never stumbling or slowing down. It would sometimes disappear behind a tree and reappear behind a different one, like it knew these woods better than any human could. I was crying and praying by this point, my lungs burning. Our house was maybe a quarter-mile away, but it felt like miles. The whole time, I could hear it behind me, keeping pace. Sometimes it would snap a branch or rustle leaves, like it was letting me know it was still there. When I finally broke through the tree line into our backyard, my older brothers were out back splitting wood. I was hysterical, trying to tell them what happened between gasps for air. They grabbed their rifles and went to check it out, even though I begged them not to. They came back about an hour later, looking pale. They found the spot where I'd been picking berries. My bucket was still there, berries scattered everywhere. But what scared them was this area they found where all the blueberry bushes had been flattened, like something huge had been laying there. The smell was still strong enough to make them gag. For weeks afterward, we'd hear strange noises at night, wood-knocking sounds and what sounded like whooping calls deep in the woods. Dad would find weird scratches high up on trees, way higher than any normal animal could reach. But by the end of summer, it all just stopped. Like whatever it was had moved on. I never went berry picking alone again. In fact, I've never gone into those woods alone since that day. My brothers tried to convince me it was just a bear, But I know what I saw. Bears don't walk upright through dense forest. Bears don't pace you like that thing did. Bears don't move the way it moved. Some folks in town said I was just a kid with an overactive imagination. Others would get real quiet when I told my story, like they knew something but didn't want to say it. Over the years, I've heard other stories from around Nasca County. Hunters seeing similar things, farmers finding huge footprints in their fields, people hearing those same wood knocks and calls. I'm an old woman now, and I've had a good life. Raised 3 kids, have 8 grandchildren. Never told this story to many people because I didn't want them thinking I was crazy. But I know what I saw that evening. Sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night, I can still smell that awful smell and hear those heavy footsteps following behind me. The thing that gets me most, even all these years later, is wondering why it didn't catch me. It could have. I know that for certain. It was faster and stronger than me, knew the woods better than me. But it chose to just follow me, almost like it was escorting me out of its territory. Maybe it was just curious. Maybe it was protecting something. I'll never know for sure. I still live in Minnesota, though not in Nasca County anymore. Sometimes I drive past those woods, and I always get that same feeling, like something's watching me from between the trees. I don't know if it's still out there, or if there are more of them. But I know what I experienced that day was real as the wooden floor beneath my feet or the pen in my hand as I write this. To this day, I can't eat blueberries anymore. The sight of them brings it all back. The golden evening light, the heavy air, and those impossibly long arms swaying as it moved through the trees behind me. Some memories just stick with you, I guess, no matter how much time passes. Story 16. It was November 12th, 1960. I remember the date clearly because it was the opening weekend of deer season in Minnesota. The weather was unusually mild for that time of year, with just a light dusting of snow on the ground. I was 27 then, had been hunting since I was a teenager, and knew the areas around Clearwater County like the back of my hand. That morning, I'd left my cabin near Lake McKenzie around sunrise. The hunting hadn't been great. I'd seen a few does, but was holding out for a buck. By late afternoon, I decided to try my luck near the lake's northern shore, where I knew there was a natural game trail the deer often used. The sun was getting low, probably around 4 p.m., and I was starting to think about heading back. The temperature had dropped, and my feet were getting cold despite my thermal socks. I remember checking my watch and thinking I had maybe another 30 minutes of decent light left. I was moving slowly along the shoreline, trying to stay quiet in the crusty snow, when I heard something that sounded like splashing. At first, I figured it was probably a deer coming down to drink, so I carefully made my way toward the sound, keeping close to some large pine trees for cover. What I saw next, I still get goosebumps thinking about it. About 50 yards ahead, there was this thing sitting on a fallen oak tree near the water's edge. At first, my brain couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. It was huge, way bigger than any black bear I'd ever encountered. The creature was hunched over, and even in that position I could tell it would easily stand 7 feet tall if it got up. It was holding something in its hands. I realized it was a fish, probably a northern pike based on the size. The way it was eating, it wasn't like an animal. It was using its hands almost like a person would, tearing off pieces and bringing them to its mouth. The face, God, the face is what really got to me. It was covered in short brown hair like the rest of its body, but you could see the facial features clearly. The top of its head came to an odd point, almost cone-shaped, and its neck was thick and barely visible. I stood there frozen, my hunting rifle hanging uselessly at my side. I must have been downwind because it hadn't noticed me yet. The longer I watched, the more details I noticed. Its arms looked surprisingly normal in length, not long and gangly like you'd expect from a monster. But its legs, they were massive, thick with muscle, and relatively long compared to its torso. I estimate it must have weighed at least 400 pounds, maybe more. The brown hair covering its body wasn't shaggy like you see in those blurry photos people share. It was shorter, almost like a deer's winter coat, but darker. What happened next is burned into my memory forever. I shifted my weight slightly, and a twig snapped under my boot. The sound wasn't very loud, but in that quiet forest, it might as well have been a gunshot. The creature's head snapped up immediately, looking directly at me. For a brief moment, couldn't have been more than a second or two, our eyes met. They were dark, intelligent eyes, not animal eyes. There was something eerily human in that gaze, a flash of recognition or understanding that made my blood run cold. Then it let out a sound I'll never forget, a horrifying scream that started like a woman's shriek, but transformed into something that reminded me of a lynx's call, only much deeper and louder. The sound echoed across the lake, and I swear I felt it in my chest. The creature moved with incredible speed for its size. It dropped the fish and was on its feet in one fluid motion. Despite my shock, part of my brain registered that I'd been right about its height. It was easily 7 feet tall, probably more. Before I could even think about raising my rifle, it had turned and was crashing through the underbrush away from the lake. The sound of breaking branches and its heavy footfalls faded surprisingly quickly. It moved through the dense forest like it knew exactly where it was going, not just running blindly in panic. My legs were shaking so badly I had to sit down. I must have stayed there for at least 15 minutes, trying to convince myself that what I'd seen wasn't real. But I knew it was. The half-eaten fish was still there on the fallen log, and the snow had its tracks. When I finally got up the nerve, I approached the log. The tracks were unlike anything I'd ever seen, and I'd been tracking animals my whole life. They were huge, 14 to 16 inches long at least, and remarkably wide, probably 8 to 10 inches. But what really struck me was how human-like they were, with 5 distinct toes. The impression in the snow was deep. Whatever made those tracks was incredibly heavy. I didn't have a camera with me. This was 1960, remember. We didn't carry phones everywhere back then. I did have a small notebook in my jacket that I used to mark down deer signs, and I tried my best to sketch the tracks and write down everything I could remember while it was fresh in my mind. By then, the sun was setting, and an overwhelming sense of vulnerability came over me. I practically ran back to my cabin, constantly looking over my shoulder. That night, I barely slept. Every sound from the forest made me jump, and I kept replaying the encounter in my mind. The next morning, I went back with my brother-in-law's Polaroid camera, but an overnight snow had covered most of the tracks. You could still see some depressions where they'd been, but they weren't clear anymore. The fish bones were still there on the log, though. I took pictures of those, but they just looked like any old fish remains. I didn't tell many people about what happened. My wife knew, and my brother-in-law, but that's it. Who would believe me? But I know what I saw. That creature was real, and it was no bear, no known animal. I've spent countless hours since then researching similar encounters, trying to make sense of what I saw that day. I never went hunting alone after that. Something about that creature's eyes. They haunted me. There was an intelligence there that suggested it wasn't just some undiscovered animal. It knew what it was doing, had purpose in its movements. The way it used its hands to eat that fish. It was too human-like. Over the years, I've heard other stories from around Clearwater County. Strange screams in the night, massive tracks found in remote areas, glimpses of something large moving through the trees. But I've never seen it again, and part of me is grateful for that. I'm an old man now, and I've had a lot of time to think about what happened that day. I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything. I just know what I saw, and I know that there are things in this world that we don't understand. That afternoon at Lake McKenzie taught me that some mysteries are better left alone. The creature I saw that day wasn't movie monster. It wasn't some guy in a suit. It was something else entirely, something that seemed to exist in that gray area between man and beast. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, still roaming the forests around Lake McKenzie, still watching humans from the shadows, like it watched me that day. I still have those old notes I took, tucked away in a box in my attic. The pencil sketches have faded over the years, but the memory hasn't. Sometimes when I can't sleep at night, I find myself thinking about those eyes, those terrifyingly intelligent eyes, and I wonder if somewhere out there, that creature remembers me too. Story 17. My mother and I were gathering firewood for the coming winter near our cabin in Clearwater County. It was early October, crisp, but not yet bitter cold. The leaves had started turning, painting the forest in brilliant reds and golds. We'd been at it for about an hour, working our way through a stand of old birch trees, when Mom called out to me, "Danny, come look at this." I remember being slightly annoyed. We still had a lot of wood to collect, and daylight was burning. But something in her voice made me stop. Mom wasn't one to get excited over nothing. She'd grown up in these woods too, taught me half of what I knew about tracking. When I reached her, she was standing completely still, staring at the ground. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. The impression in the soft earth was huge, bigger than any bear track I'd ever seen, and I'd seen plenty. It measured about 14 inches long, but that wasn't what made it strange. The shape was all wrong. It had 4 toes, not 5 like a human, and the foot was completely flat. There was this odd bulge on the outer edge near the heel that I'd never seen in any track before or since. But the really unsettling thing, it wasn't just one track. There was a line of them, perfectly straight, like whatever made them was following an invisible path. I measured the distance between prints, 4 feet apart. That's a hell of a stride. Even a tall man would have to jump to make prints that far apart, and nobody jumps in a perfectly straight line while walking through woods. Mom grabbed my arm. Her hand was shaking. "We need to leave, now." I tried to laugh it off. "Come on, Mom. It's probably just—" "No." She cut me off sharply. "Something's not right here. I can feel it." Now, you have to understand something about my mother. She wasn't some nervous city person who jumped at every forest sound. She was tough as nails, had faced down bears, and survived Minnesota blizzards. I'd never seen her spooked like this. She insisted we pack up and head back to the cabin. I agreed, mostly to calm her down, but I couldn't stop thinking about those tracks. After getting her settled at home, I grabbed my rifle and tracking gear and headed back out. I told her I was just going to check our trap lines. She knew I was lying, but she didn't stop me, just made me promise to be back before dark. The tracks were easy to follow, too easy, really. Whatever made them wasn't trying to hide. I tracked them for about 2.5 miles, heading deeper into the woods than we usually went. The whole time, that perfectly straight line continued, over fallen logs, through thick brush, across small streams. Nothing changed that creature's stride or direction. Then I came to the fence. It was an old boundary fence, about 8 feet high, built to keep elk from the Johnsons' property. The tracks went right up to it and continued on the other side. Same spacing, same direction, like the fence wasn't even there. No broken wires, no bent posts, nothing to show how something that big got over it. The sun was getting low, casting long shadows through the trees. That's when I noticed how quiet it had gotten. Minnesota woods are never truly silent. There's always birds, squirrels, something moving around. But right then, nothing. Just the sound of my own breathing and the blood pounding in my ears. I felt it before I heard anything. A heaviness in the air, like just before a big storm. Then came this smell, musky, wild, but not like any animal I knew. My hand tightened on my rifle. though somehow I knew it wouldn't do me any good. From somewhere ahead came a sound I still hear in my nightmares. Not quite a growl, not quite human. It was deep, resonating in my chest like distant thunder. The trees about 50 yards ahead started swaying, though there wasn't any wind. I'd like to say I stood my ground, that I was brave and faced whatever it was. But 25 years of hunting instincts screamed at me to run, and for the first time in my life, I listened. I turned and ran all the way back to the cabin, not stopping once, not looking back. Mum was waiting on the porch. She took one look at my face and just nodded. We never talked about what happened that day, but we moved the woodpile closer to the house and never went back to that part of the woods again. The strange thing is, after that day, the tracks just disappeared. No more straight lines through the forest, no more giant footprints. Whatever it was moved on, I guess. I've spent decades trying to rationalize what I saw. Could have been some kind of bear, maybe a deformed moose. But deep down, I know better. There are things in these woods that don't fit into neat scientific categories. I still hunt, still spend plenty of time in the forest. But I'm more cautious now, more aware. Sometimes, when I'm out alone and the woods get too quiet, I remember those tracks and that sound, and I make sure I'm heading home before the shadows get too long. I've never told this story publicly before. Folks around here don't talk about these things, and I understand why. But I'm getting older now, and I figure someone should know what happened that day. Make of it what you will, but everything I've written here is true. I know because I lived it. And not a day goes by that I don't think about those perfectly straight tracks leading through the Minnesota woods and whatever made them. Story 18. I'd set up my blind near one of my favorite spots, about half a mile from where we'd parked. Jim, my hunting buddy, had forgotten some shells in his truck and headed back to get them. I wasn't worried. We'd been hunting these wetlands for years, and I knew every inch of that terrain. The fog was thick that morning, hanging low over the marsh like a white blanket. I remember checking my watch, 6:15 a.m. The sun wasn't quite up yet, but there was enough light to see maybe 30-40 feet ahead. I was adjusting my decoys, making sure they looked natural in the water when I first heard it. At first I thought it was Jim coming back. The footsteps were heavy, making that distinct sound of someone walking through wet marsh grass. But something felt wrong. The steps were too heavy, too spread apart. I remember thinking, damn it, Jim, you're going to scare every duck from here to Canada stomping around like that. The footsteps got closer, and I started getting irritated. I was about to yell at Jim to be quieter when I caught movement in my peripheral vision. That's when everything changed. I turned my head to look out of my blind, expecting to see Jim's orange hunting vest. Instead, I found myself staring at what I can only describe as a massive wall of black fur. I was eye level with its chest, and I'm not a small guy. I stand 6'3". The creature must have been at least 8 feet tall, maybe more. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. The fur was thick and dark, almost blue-black in the early morning light. It had a musty, earthy smell, like wet dog mixed with decomposing leaves and something else I can't describe. The creature was methodically pulling at some roots or plants near my blind, using these enormous hands that looked almost human-like, but much, much bigger. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My hunting instincts should have kicked in. I had my shotgun right there in my hands. But something about this thing. It wasn't just an animal. The way it moved, the way it was carefully examining the plants. There was an intelligence there that made my blood run cold. What happened next is still vivid in my mind. The creature must have sensed my presence because it slowly turned its head toward the blind. I caught a glimpse of its face, so human-like yet so different. Its eyes. God, its eyes. They weren't animal eyes. They were intelligent, almost contemplative. Dark brown, set deep under a prominent brow ridge. They locked with mine for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a second or two. That's when panic finally kicked in. I raised my shotgun instinctively, but I couldn't bring myself to aim at it. Something in those eyes. It just felt wrong, like pointing a gun at a person. Instead, I fired into the air, the sound deafening in the morning stillness. The creature's reaction was immediate. It straightened up to its full height, and Jesus, it was enormous, and made this sound that I still hear in my nightmares. Not quite a roar, not quite a scream, but something in between. The sound seemed to come from deep in its chest, reverberating through the marsh. I dropped my gun and ran. I'm not proud of it, but I ran like hell. I was screaming for Jim, crashing through the marsh, not caring about the noise or the water or anything else. I could hear it moving behind me, branches breaking, water splashing, but it wasn't chasing me. It was moving away in the opposite direction. I ran all the way back to the parking area, where I found Jim just getting back to his truck. He said he'd heard my shot and my screaming and was about to come looking for me. He told me I was white as a sheet and shaking like a leaf. We went back to retrieve my gun and gear about an hour later, after I'd calmed down enough to walk straight. The area around my blind was trampled, with huge footprints in the mud, way bigger than any human foot. We found some of the roots the creature had been pulling up scattered around. They were yanked clean out of the ground with strength no human could muster. That was my last day hunting alone. Hell, it was my last day hunting that spot entirely. I still go out for ducks, but never alone, and never in that part of Houston County. Some people say I imagined it, that the fog played tricks on my mind, but I know what I saw. Those eyes, they weren't animal eyes. That wasn't just some bear or other wildlife. It was something else entirely. I've spent years trying to make sense of what happened that morning. Why didn't it attack me? What was it looking for in those roots? Sometimes I wonder if I should have tried to communicate with it somehow, but then I remember the sheer size of it, the raw power evident in every movement, and I know I made the right choice running away. The weird thing is, there were never any other reported sightings in that area, at least none that made it to the papers or the local authorities. Sometimes I wonder if maybe that's because others, like me, were too scared or embarrassed to come forward. Or maybe, just maybe, what I encountered that morning was just passing through, following some ancient path that we humans have long forgotten. I'm 83 now, and I still think about that morning. The memory hasn't faded one bit. Every detail is as clear as if it happened yesterday. I've never been able to explain it, and I've stopped trying to. Some things in this world just defy explanation, and maybe that's okay. But I know what I saw that morning in the Minnesota marshland, and nothing will ever convince me otherwise. Story 19. I've never really talked about this before, except with close family. Even after all these years, my hands still get shaky when I think about what I saw that fall morning in '68. I was 19 then, and my brother Tom and I were out duck hunting at Hawk Lake in Clearwater County, Minnesota. It was one of those crisp October mornings where your breath hangs in the air like little clouds. We'd gotten there before sunrise, like we always did. The lake was dead quiet, except for the occasional splash of a fish or the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Tom had wandered off to check out a spot where we'd seen a bunch of mallards the day before, leaving me with the truck. I remember being kind of annoyed about that. We usually stuck together, but he insisted he'd be quick. I was sitting in the cab of our old Ford pickup, trying to warm up my hands. The heater barely worked, but it was better than nothing. The sun was just starting to peek over the trees, casting long shadows across this big field next to where we'd parked. I remember taking a sip of coffee from my thermos when something caught my eye. At first, I thought maybe it was just a shadow playing tricks on me. You know how your mind can wander when you're alone in the early morning. But then it moved. I've spent my whole life in these woods. I know what bears look like when they stand up. I know what moose look like from every angle. This was something else entirely. The thing that stepped out from the tree line was massive, not just tall, but impossibly huge. We had this big old oak tree in that field, must have been at least 30 feet high, and this creature's head was easily level with its lower branches. The way it moved is what really got to me. It wasn't lumbering like a bear, or awkward like someone in a costume. Each step it took covered more ground than seemed possible, but it was smooth, natural. Its arms swung at its sides, but not like a person's would. They were just too long, reaching almost to its knees. I remember every detail like it was burned into my brain. The creature was covered in dark, almost black hair that looked matted in some places. Its shoulders were incredibly broad, maybe 3 times the width of a big man. The head sat directly on those shoulders. There wasn't much of a neck to speak of. And the smell. Even through the closed windows of the truck, this overwhelming, musty, wet dog kind of odor seeped in. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I wanted to grab my rifle from the back seat, but I couldn't move. It wasn't exactly fear that paralyzed me. It was more like my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. Everything I knew about what was possible in our woods just didn't apply anymore. The creature stopped about halfway across the field. To this day, I don't know if it knew I was there. It turned slightly, and I got a glimpse of its face. That's when the real terror hit me. Its face was almost human, but wrong somehow. The brow ridge was massive, shadowing these deep-set eyes that looked intelligent. Too intelligent. I fumbled for the camera we kept in the glove compartment, one of those old Kodaks, but my hands were shaking so bad I dropped it under the seat. When I finally fished it out and looked up again, the creature had moved. It was covering ground so fast, but still with that same smooth stride. It was heading toward the denser part of the forest to the west. Just then, I heard a shot echo across the lake, probably Tom taking a shot at some ducks. The creature's head snapped toward the sound, and in 2 massive strides, it disappeared into the tree line. The whole encounter couldn't have lasted more than 2 or 3 minutes, but it felt like hours. When Tom got back to the truck about 20 minutes later, I was still sitting there, gripping the steering wheel. He took one look at my face and knew something was wrong. I tried to tell him what I'd seen, but the words wouldn't come out right. How do you explain something like that? It wasn't until years later, in the early 80s, that it really hit home. My dad, Stanley, came back from a fishing trip near International Falls with his own story. He described the exact same thing: the impossible height, the fluid movement, the intelligent eyes. He hadn't known about what I'd seen. I'd never told him. But when he described that face, that same wrong but human face, I felt that old terror creep back in. I'm 75 now, and I've spent countless hours trying to rationalize what I saw that morning. I've read every book I could find about similar sightings, joined online forums, even went back to that spot a few times over the years. The field is different now. Houses have sprung up where there used to be just wilderness. But sometimes, when I'm driving past Hawk Lake in the early morning, I catch myself scanning the tree line, wondering if it's still out there. I know how this sounds. If someone told me this story, I'd probably think they were crazy or making it up for attention. But I know what I saw. That creature was as real as the keyboard I'm typing on right now. Sometimes I wish I could forget it, go back to when the world made sense and everything in our woods could be explained. But you can't unsee something like that. It changes you. The strangest part? In all these years, I've never felt threatened by what I saw. Terrified, yes, but not in danger. It was like stumbling across something ancient and powerful, something that was never meant to be seen by human eyes, something that existed long before us and will probably exist long after we're gone. I still go hunting with Tom. We're both retired now, but we try to get out there when we can. We've never seen anything like it again, and maybe that's for the best. But every fall, when the leaves start to turn and that crisp morning air rolls in, I think about that day, about how thin the line is between the world we think we know and something else entirely. I don't expect anyone to believe me. I'm not sure I would, if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. But I know what I saw that morning in 1968, and no amount of time or rationalization will ever convince me otherwise. Sometimes, late at night, I can still hear those impossibly long strides moving through that field, still smell that strange, musty odor. And I wonder if somewhere out there, in the deep woods of Minnesota, that creature is still walking, still watching, still keeping its secrets. Story 20. It was a crisp October evening, and my older brother Tom had let me tag along while he took his girlfriend Sarah out to the drive-in theater in his '65 Chevy Impala. I was in the back seat, probably being the annoying little brother I usually was. The movie had run later than expected, and it was already dark when we started heading home along County Road 83, a stretch of rural highway surrounded by cornfields and dense woods. The night was unusually bright because of the full moon, and there was this eerie fog starting to roll in from the fields. Tom had the radio playing quietly. I remember it was some Creedence Clearwater revival song. Sarah was dozing off in the passenger seat, and I was just staring out the window, watching the moonlight play off the corn stalks. We were maybe 15 minutes from home when everything went to hell. I noticed movement in the drainage ditch on the right side of the road. At first, I thought it was just shadows from the fog, but then something massive burst out onto the road about 50 feet ahead of us. Tom slammed on the brakes, and Sarah jerked awake with a scream. What I saw next is burned into my memory forever. Standing there in our headlights was this thing. It was enormous, had to be at least 7 or 8 feet tall. The headlights illuminated its body, which was covered in thick black hair. But it wasn't like any animal I'd ever seen. It was standing upright like a man, but it had this massive bulk to it. Must have weighed well over 300 pounds. Its arms were incredibly long, hanging down past its knees. The scariest part was how it reacted to us. This wasn't some dumb animal that accidentally wandered onto the road. It raised its arms up in this deliberate way, like it was trying to stop us. I remember seeing its hands. They looked almost human-like, but bigger, with these long fingers. The way it moved was so purposeful, so intelligent. That's what really got to me. Tom was cursing under his breath, gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles were white. Sarah had her hand over her mouth, completely frozen. The creature just stood there for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds. Then, right as Tom started to ease off the brake, it suddenly leaped to the side of the road with this incredible agility that seemed impossible for something so big. I think that's when we all realized this was real. This wasn't some guy in a costume or our eyes playing tricks on us. The way it moved, no human could move like that. Tom hit the gas, but I turned around in my seat to keep watching it. I could see it standing there in the red glow of our taillights, just staring after us. Then Tom said something that still makes my blood run cold when I think about it. "Let's go back and get a better look." Before Sarah or I could protest, he was already making a U-turn. Looking back now, I can't believe we were that stupid. But we were young and didn't have the sense to be as scared as we should have been. As we approached the spot again, driving slower this time, our headlights caught it. It was still there, standing just off the shoulder of the road. But this time, something was different. It seemed angry. Its posture had changed, and it was swaying slightly like it was agitated. Then it did something none of us expected. It charged the car. I'm not exaggerating when I say the whole car shook when it hit us. It slammed into the trunk with such force that Tom lost control for a second. Sarah was screaming, and I remember the sound of metal crunching. Tom floored it, and we got out of there as fast as that Impala could take us. When we finally got home, we checked the damage. There was this massive dent in the trunk lid, and this is the detail that still haunts me. You could make out what looked like knuckle impressions in the metal. Tom tried to tell our parents he'd backed into a tree, but I don't think they ever really believed that story. You'd think that would be the end of it, but it wasn't. Over the next few weeks, that thing seemed to be everywhere. I'd see it when I was walking home from my friend's house at dusk, just a massive dark shape moving through the cornfields. Sometimes at night, I'd hear something heavy moving around outside my window, and in the morning, there'd be these huge footprints in the mud. The worst was about 2 weeks after the first incident. I was up late doing homework in my room, which faced the backyard and the fields beyond. It was another moonlit night, and I happened to glance out the window. There it was, standing at the edge of our property, partially illuminated by the security light on our barn. It was just watching, standing perfectly still, staring at our house. I sat there paralyzed for what must have been 20 minutes, afraid to move, afraid to look away. Eventually, it just turned and walked into the cornfield, its movement causing the stalks to sway unnaturally in the moonlight. Tom saw it too several times. Once, while he was working on his car in the driveway, he heard something in the woods behind our house. When he looked up, he said he could see its eyes reflecting the light from his work lamp. Sarah refused to come over to our house after dark anymore. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sightings stopped. By the time November rolled around, there was nothing. No footprints, no sounds in the night, no dark shape in the fields. It was like it had never been there at all. Over the years, I've tried to make sense of what happened that autumn. I've read every book I could find about similar encounters, joined online forums, even went to a few conferences about unexplained phenomena. I've heard all the theories, that it was a Bigfoot, that it was some kind of escaped experiment, that it was mass hysteria. But none of them quite capture what we experienced. The thing that really gets me even now is the intelligence we saw in that creature. The way it deliberately tried to stop our car that first night, how it seemed to watch our house, how it appeared to understand exactly what it was doing. This wasn't just some animal acting on instinct. Whatever it was, it had purpose. I still live in Minnesota, though not in Ottertail County anymore. I've never gone back to that stretch of County Road 83, and I don't plan to. Tom moved out to California years ago, and we rarely talk about what happened. Sarah married someone else and moved away. Last I heard, she refuses to even drive on rural roads at night anymore. Sometimes, on nights when the moon is full and the fog rolls in across the fields, I find myself looking out my window, half expecting to see that massive shape standing there in the darkness. I never have, but I keep looking, because the thing about an experience like this is that it changes you forever. You realize that the world is a much stranger place than we want to believe, and that some questions might never have answers. I know how this story sounds. If someone had told it to me before that night in 1969, I probably wouldn't have believed them either. But everything I've written here is true. Every detail is exactly as I remember it, and trust me, I remember it all very clearly. Some things you just can't forget, no matter how much time passes. To this day, I've never found a satisfying explanation for what we encountered. Maybe there isn't one, but I know what I saw, what my brother saw, what Sarah saw. And I know that somewhere out there, in the dark spaces between civilization, there are things that defy our understanding. Things that remind us that we don't know nearly as much about our world as we think we do. Story 21. I've been a forest ranger in St. Louis County, Minnesota for nearly 15 years now, but what happened that night in '76 still haunts me. I've never told this story publicly before, but I need to get it off my chest. Maybe someone else has experienced something similar and can help me make sense of it. I was stationed at an old Finnish farmstead deep in the Superior National Forest. It was early October, and the nights were getting colder. The assignment seemed routine, just watching over some equipment and doing regular patrols. The property had a main house and a few outbuildings, typical for an old homestead. The current owners used it mainly during hunting season. That night I was told to sleep in a blue canvas tent about 25 yards south of the main house. It wasn't unusual. We often set up temporary posts like this to monitor different areas. The yard had those old-style security lights that cast everything in a harsh yellow glow. I remember being slightly annoyed because it made it harder to spot wildlife movement in the darkness beyond. I'd done my final rounds around 10:30 p.m. Everything was quiet except for the usual forest sounds. Wind in the pines, occasional owl calls. I noted how still the air felt, almost heavy with moisture like it gets before snow. My supervisor and 2 other staff members were sleeping in the main house. I had my radio, flashlight, and standard gear. Nothing felt out of the ordinary. I must have dozed off around 11 p.m. The next thing I remember was jerking awake to the sound of footsteps in the grass. At first, I thought it was a deer. We got plenty of those wandering through at night. But these steps were different, heavier, more deliberate, and definitely bipedal. My training kicked in, and I lay perfectly still, controlling my breathing. The steps were coming from the direction of the tree line, moving toward my tent. That's when I saw it. A shadow cast on the tent wall by the yard light. My blood ran cold. It was clearly walking on 2 legs, but the proportions were all wrong. The stride was too long, the arms too low. The thing passed within 10 feet of my tent. I could hear its breathing, deep, rhythmic sounds that no human or animal I knew could make. It moved about 40 feet to my right and just stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. My first thought was that it might be my supervisor checking the perimeter. I called out, "Hey Dave, that you?" My voice sounded pathetically small in the darkness. No response, just that heavy breathing somewhere in the darkness. Then the footsteps started again. This time, they were coming directly toward my tent. I felt the vibration of each step in the ground beneath me. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else. The shadow appeared again on the tent wall, larger this time, as if it was leaning closer. I'd like to say I acted professionally, that I followed protocol. But in that moment, raw instinct took over. I grabbed my flashlight and burst out of the tent, running full speed toward the main house. I've never moved so fast in my life. I didn't look back, didn't stop until I was inside with the door locked behind me. When I finally caught my breath, I woke up Dave and the others. We did a thorough search of the property with flashlights and rifles, but found nothing except some odd impressions in the grass. They were like footprints, but much larger than any human foot, and deeper on one side, as if whatever made them had an unusual gait. The next morning, we checked the security cameras mounted on the house. Here's the strange part. There was some kind of interference on all the footage from 11:15 p.m. to about 11:45 p.m., just static and distorted images. The cameras worked perfectly fine before and after that time frame. We interviewed the nearby residents and checked the logs. Nobody else was supposed to be in that area. The nearest neighbor was over 3 miles away. No other rangers were on duty in that sector. Whatever I encountered that night wasn't human. I've spent countless hours trying to rationalize what happened. Could it have been a bear walking upright? The shadow and movements were too human-like. A prankster in a costume. The breathing and footsteps were unlike anything I've ever heard, and who would trek miles into the forest at night just to scare a ranger? The incident was officially logged as unexplained wildlife activity, but that doesn't begin to capture what I experienced. I still work as a ranger, but I've never slept in a tent on duty since then. Some nights, when I'm doing my rounds and the wind picks up, I swear I can hear those same heavy footsteps in the distance. The owners eventually sold the property, and the last I heard, the new owners demolished the old Finnish farmhouse. Maybe they had their own experiences they couldn't explain. All I know is that something was out there that night. Something that shouldn't exist, but does. And the worst part is knowing it's probably still out there in those woods, watching and waiting. I've read other accounts of strange encounters in the Superior National Forest, but most people are afraid to come forward for fear of ridicule. I understand that fear all too well. But after keeping this bottled up for so long, I needed to share my story. Make of it what you will, but I know what I experienced that night was real. The Superior National Forest holds many secrets. Most of them are beautiful and awe-inspiring, but some are better left undisturbed. I still do my job, still patrol those woods, but I never go out alone at night anymore. And whenever I hear heavy footsteps in the darkness, I head the other way. Story 22. It was a pretty typical day for us. Dad and I had been hauling timber since dawn, making runs between the logging site and the mill. The weather was starting to turn. You know how Minnesota gets in late fall, and we were trying to get as much work done as possible before the heavy snows hit. Around 5 p.m., we were making what we figured would be our last run of the day. Dad was behind the wheel of our old International harvester, and I was riding shotgun, fighting to stay awake after a long day's work. The sun was setting, creating that awful glare that makes driving west absolutely miserable. Dad had been complaining about the load shifting, so he'd pulled over to check the chains one more time. I remember watching him in the side mirror as he walked back toward the trailer, his breath visible in the cold air. That's when it happened. At first, I thought it was just another shadow from the trees. The sun was hitting my eyes just right to make everything look weird and distorted. But then it moved. About 50 yards ahead of us, this figure emerged from the tree line. The moment I saw it step out, everything in my body just went cold. You know that feeling when you realize something is fundamentally wrong with what you're looking at? That's what hit me. This thing was massive. I'm 6'1", and it would have towered over me easily. If I had to guess, it was somewhere between 6'5" and 7 feet tall, but what really struck me was its build. It wasn't just tall, it was huge. Built like a linebacker, but bigger, much bigger. I'd estimate it weighed somewhere between 300–400 pounds, but it moved with this grace that shouldn't have been possible for something that size. The way it walked was what convinced me this wasn't a person in a suit or some kind of prank. Its stride was incredibly long, and its arms, God, those arms were wrong. They hung down way too far, swinging with each step in this unnaturally fluid way. The legs moved differently too, like they had an extra joint or something. I know that sounds crazy, but that's what I saw. It was crossing this drainage ditch by the road, and that's when the worst part happened. It must have heard the truck's engine idling because it suddenly stopped and turned its head toward us. Just typing this now, my hands are shaking. The way it moved its head was so deliberate, so aware. It looked right at me. I know it did. Even though I couldn't make out its features clearly in the fading light, I could feel its eyes locked onto mine. I wanted to call out to my dad, but my voice wouldn't work. My mouth was dry, and my heart was hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. I just sat there, frozen, watching this impossible thing staring back at me. Time seemed to stop, and for what felt like forever, we just looked at each other. Then something changed. Maybe it was my dad slamming the truck's back panel as he finished checking the chains, or maybe the creature just decided it had seen enough. But the way it moved next, I've never seen anything move that fast. 1 second it was there, and the next it was covering ground back toward the forest with these huge, fluid strides. It didn't run exactly. It was more like it glided, eating up the distance between the road and the tree line in seconds. By the time my dad got back in the cab, it was gone. I remember him asking if I was okay because apparently I looked white as a sheet. I tried to tell him what I'd seen, but the words wouldn't come out right. How do you tell your hard-working, practical father that you just saw something that shouldn't exist? Later that night, after we'd unloaded, and I'd had time to process what happened, I tried to draw what I'd seen in my notebook, but nothing I drew came close to capturing it. The proportions were all wrong, but not in the way my drawings were wrong, in the way that nature sometimes creates things that don't quite make sense to our eyes. I've spent decades trying to rationalize what I saw that day. I've read about bears walking on their hind legs, about the tricks light can play on your eyes at sunset, about how our minds can construct false images when we're tired. But none of those explanations fit. What I saw was real, solid, and moved with purpose. The thing that haunts me most isn't the size of the creature, or its impossible movements, or even the way it looked at me. It's the intelligence I sensed in that moment our eyes met. There was something ancient and aware in that gaze, something that knew exactly what it was and what I was. It wasn't just some animal reacting to a noise or movement. It was evaluating me. I've never gone public with this story before because, honestly, who would believe it? A teenager seeing Bigfoot on a logging road in Minnesota. It sounds like every other crazy story out there. But I know what I saw. That moment is burned into my memory as clearly as my wedding day or the birth of my kids. Sometimes when I'm driving that stretch of road, which I still have to do pretty regularly, I slow down near that spot. The ditch is still there, though it's more overgrown now. The forest has changed too. Some areas have been logged and new trees have grown up. But every time I pass by, I can't help but wonder if it's still out there, watching from just beyond the tree line, just as aware of us as we are unaware of it. I'm 67 now, and I've never seen anything like it again. But I know it was real. Something that doesn't fit into our neat categories of what should and shouldn't exist walked across that road in 1976, and for a brief moment it looked into my eyes and knew me. That's not the kind of thing you can forget or explain away, no matter how many years pass. Story 23. It was mid-July, hot and humid like you'd expect. We'd set up our camp near one of the old railroad tracks that cut through the wilderness. You know, those abandoned lines that seem to go on forever through the woods. The mosquitoes were brutal that year, but we didn't care. We were young, fearless, and honestly, pretty stupid. That morning started like any other. We'd had our breakfast of beans and coffee, planning to spend the day exploring some new fishing spots. The air was thick with that distinctive northern Minnesota summer smell, pine needles, damp earth, and stagnant water from the surrounding swamps. Looking back, I should have noticed something was off. The woods were quieter than usual, but when you're 19, you don't pick up on those subtle warnings nature gives you. Around 11 a.m., we were walking along the tracks, joking around and swatting mosquitoes. Gary was leading the way, pointing out some deer tracks when he suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. I nearly bumped into him. That's when I saw it too. About 50 yards ahead, partially hidden behind a massive pine tree, was something I still can't fully explain. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it. Was it a bear standing upright? No, the proportions were all wrong. This thing was tall, I'd estimate around 6'5", and covered in dark, matted fur. But what really got me were its shoulders. They were massive, much broader than any humans, but the way it was standing was unmistakably humanoid. I remember my mouth going completely dry. Rick whispered, "What the fuck is that?" But it came out as barely a croak. The creature was just watching us, not moving, not making a sound, just staring, I couldn't make out its face clearly from that distance, but I could feel its eyes on us. Gary, always the bravest or most foolish of us, took a step forward. That's when everything went to hell. The creature moved, and God, the way it moved. It wasn't like a bear or any other animal I've ever seen. It turned and ran on two legs, disappearing into the thick brush beside the tracks. We stood there frozen for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds. Then, like idiots, we decided to check out where it had been standing. As we got closer, this overwhelming stench hit us, like a combination of rotting meat and wet, moldy clothes. Gary called it PU feet, but that doesn't really capture how awful and unnatural it was. The smell made my eyes water. The ground around the tree was disturbed, with clear impressions in the damp soil, but they weren't clear enough to make out any details. We were all talking at once, trying to make sense of what we'd seen, when something made us go quiet again. The sound of branches breaking came from the swamp to our right. We were already on edge, but what happened next nearly made me piss myself. A rock, not a small one, mind you, but one about the size of a football, came sailing out of the trees to our left, flying right between Rick and me. It landed with a heavy thud about 10 feet away. None of us had heard anyone throw it. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. We were all looking around wildly, trying to figure out where it came from, when we saw it again. About 100 yards up ahead, the same creature crossed the tracks in 2 massive strides. The way it moved was so fluid, so purposeful, definitely not someone in a costume. Rick wanted to follow it. Can you believe that? Actually wanted to chase after this thing. Gary was with him, caught up in the moment, I guess. I'm not proud to admit it, but I was the one who said we should go back. Something deep in my gut was screaming that we were in way over our heads. We did try to follow it briefly, but the terrain off the tracks was treacherous, all swamp and thick undergrowth. After about 10 minutes of struggling through the brush, with that horrible smell getting stronger, we heard something large moving through the swamp ahead of us. The sounds it made pushing through the vegetation were not like anything I've ever heard before or since, not like a deer or a bear. It was methodical, almost deliberate. That's when we heard what I can only describe as a sound between a grunt and a cough, but much deeper than any human could make. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Rick, who'd been so eager to chase this thing, turned white as a sheet. We all looked at each other, and without saying a word, turned around and got the hell out of there. We practically ran back to our campsite, packed up our stuff, and left. We didn't even discuss it. We just knew we had to get out of there. The whole drive home, we barely spoke. What could we say? We'd seen something that shouldn't exist, something that completely shattered our understanding of what was possible. I've spent decades trying to rationalize what happened that day. I've read every scientific explanation I could find about bears walking upright, about the tricks light and fear can play on your mind, but none of it explains everything we saw. The way it moved, that terrible smell, the thrown rock. It was all too deliberate, too intelligent. Gary passed away last year, and Rick moved to Arizona in the 80s. I've never been back to that specific area of Lake of the Woods, and I never will. Sometimes when I'm lying awake at night, I still hear that deep, guttural sound, and I wonder what would have happened if we'd kept following those tracks into the swamp. I know how this story sounds. If someone had told me this before it happened, I would have thought they were full of shit. But I know what I saw that day. I know what we all saw. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I wonder if it's still out there in those woods, watching and waiting for the next group of idiots who venture too far off the beaten path.